There we go. Tried now. How is the audio? Have we got it up and running? I think I found the problem. Okay, we're back. How is the volume? Is the audio clear and loud enough? Okay. Thank you. So I'm just going to chat for a couple of minutes and then we'll get started with this program. So how this started was I was asked by the Alpine Club of Canada if I could do an online AST1 course for the Yukon section. And I said, sure. I've been working for the Alpine Club. I've been their lead winter guide since 2018. And that element of the program is starting to wind down. But I still guide actively for the Alpine Club. But I'm also expanding and working for some other operations as well. This winter, I'm doing a fair bit of instruction for the Canadian Avalanche Association. So I'm teaching and examining industry level courses. So if you've thought about taking your AST1 or AST2, the people who are teaching you have had to be certified by the Canadian Avalanche Association. And there's a process for that. I'm involved with helping to teach and train the people who will be teaching and training you. Also, there is just the basic AST courses. Back when I worked for the University of Calgary, I would probably teach 500 to 1,000 people a year with the AST1 and AST2 programs. And that's prior to working with the Alpine Club. This winter, in addition to working with the CAA, I'm going to be doing some guiding at Purcell Lodge, and I've just been invited to come up to staff training for Skeena. So this winter I'll be in northern BC doing a bit of cat skiing as well, which is actually something I'm looking quite forward to because I haven't worked in the mechanized ski industry for a long time, and most of my work has been ski touring, ski mountaineering, multi-day tours like going on the Wapta, doing the Yoho Traverse, some of the more remote things like going up on the Columbia Ice Field. And so being able to actually just jump in a cat and have someone take me up the hill instead of getting there under my own power is actually fairly appealing right now. I'm not getting any younger. Okay. Now, if you guys have any questions, just type them in. And please feel free. I may not see your post right away, but I will check fairly regularly. And there is a delay. It looks like it's about 30 seconds from the time I present till the time you see it on wherever you are. And just out of curiosity, I'd like to ask, where are participants connecting from? I asked this because years ago I did a program like this, and when I asked, I got one response from Hawaii, and I think they were on vacation. But I was quite surprised that anyone in the Hawaiian Islands would be watching an avalanche course, because maybe on Mauna Kea they get enough snow once in a while that they might just think about an avalanche. But otherwise, it's pretty slim pickings. As much as I love the Hawaii, and we go there fairly regularly, I'm not very employable. Okay, Montreal, Whitehorse, yeah, New York. Oh, that's nice. I love New York. I'm not very employable in New York, but there's really few things better than walking around Manhattan and just seeing what the world has to offer. Northern Ontario, Whitehorse, Hamilton, great. Okay, well, thank you guys. So once again, my name is Doug Latimer, and this is a course on an introduction to avalanche safety. This does follow the curriculum for the AST1, and it is essentially the same course I teach when I'm teaching in class. Okay? So, why don't we get started? And by all means, just drop me a note if things aren't working. Now, by definition, an avalanche is basically any material flowing down a steep slope. All right, that's a pretty broad definition. However, we're going to narrow that down, and we're going to say that an avalanche is specifically snow. It is not glacial ice calving off a cliff. It has to be snow coming down a slope. And the reason for that is the dynamics are very different. Snow avalanches are unique. And so because of that, we'll focus strictly on snow. If you are ski touring in the big mountains and there's hanging ice from another glacier above you, that's a whole different set of skills. And frankly, there's a lot more uncertainty and randomness involved in that kind of an event. So you need to accept a higher level of risk. Avalanches are reasonably predictable events. And so we can, under many circumstances, have a pretty high degree of certainty as to whether the area is safe or whether the area is dangerous. And then when you kind of get into that zone of if and maybe, that's the really hard part. However, having said that, if you're not sure, then you pretend it's more dangerous. Because uncertainty is really what we're trying to manage here. And if you cannot reduce the uncertainty, then ironically, that's when you're most likely to get caught in an avalanche. I'll talk about that a bit later. But we're playing basically a game of chance to some degree. And what we're really doing is stacking the odds heavily in our favor. But we can never completely eliminate the risk. And so it's when things could go either way that it's when basically our poor judgment gets the better of us and we start stepping into terrain that we probably should still give some space. But let me show you what I mean. All right. So this is an avalanche that occurred in Alaska some time ago. And you can see that steep roll. He's just skied over it and oh, geez, that was bad luck, wasn't it? There really is a tremendous amount of luck in this industry. Not because we don't know, but because we don't think. So I'll tell you in advance, this individual survives and doesn't suffer any serious physical harm. However, he is, for the most part, fully buried. And he's just become fully buried in the snow. Now, both of his hands are sticking out of the snow. And that seems kind of bizarre. Why doesn't he just dig himself out? But he can't. If you watched closely when we started, he had both ski straps on his wrists. The poles are buried, and now he is literally handcuffed and unable to move his arms to do anything. He literally has to lay there and wait. I was caught in a relatively small slide when I was working in avalanche control as a technician at a ski hill. And I was only buried up to my neck. My left arm was buried only around 20-30 centimeters of debris. I could not pull it out. All right. So this black line represents the survival rate in Switzerland. And so if you look at it, you can see that after 30 minutes, you have about a 50-50 chance of surviving in Switzerland. The red line is the aggregate survival rate in Canada. Different snowpacks have different survival rates, but the average, which is the red line there, basically tells us that survival rates in Canada tend to have much shorter windows. All right, so if you want to have a 50-50 chance of survival in Canada after being buried in an avalanche, your party has to find you within 14 minutes of your burial time. And it's more than double that in Switzerland. It's 30 minutes. Now, I used to love playing this because I could say, well, I guess, we should all go to Switzerland. Well, that doesn't quite work out that way. The actual survival numbers, not the survival rate, but the number of people who survive in Canada is about the same on a percentage basis as the number of people who survive buried in avalanches in Switzerland. We have different snowpacks than most of the Swiss. most of Switzerland, and we tend to ski terrain that has a lot higher risk for trauma, hitting rocks and hitting trees. So that increases our fatality rate. But the difference is in Canada, we actively train so that the party that's involved in the avalanche can also become the rescuers. So the members who are on the surface can initiate a rescue, whereas in Switzerland, traditionally they called for outside resources. And because Canadians respond much faster by doing it themselves, we get people out of the snow sooner, and we have about the same survival rate as they do in Switzerland. This was a few years ago. I don't know how much that has changed in terms of the Swiss culture, but they would certainly increase their survival rates if they became more actively involved in doing their own search and rescue. Because Canada is a huge country, and if somebody gets buried in an avalanche, you really have 30 minutes on the outside, except in extreme cases, for a live recovery. And if you want good odds, you want them out in 10 minutes. And to do that, basically the party that's involved in the avalanche or a party very close has to do the rescue. Okay. So it's been 3 minutes and our victim is still trapped in the snow. And you'll listen, if you listen carefully, you'll soon hear the sounds of the rescuers, but they cannot hear him. Oh. Sorry. Didn't have that turned on.
You're good, dog. You're good. Hang on, bro. You're good. Looking good, bro. Good. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 That's a good, bro. Hang on, bro. Is anything broken? Okay.
All right. So if we keep running the video, they start making some mistakes, but you know what? Don't worry about it. In the big picture, they did what they had to do. They got there quickly. They dug them out fast. That's the bottom line. You've got to clear the airway and then get the pressure off the chest, and that is what's going to save a person's life. Don't worry about the little stuff too much. And overall, that was a very, very fast rescue. Even though you're sort of listening to this and watching it over time, it feels very long. They did a really good job. They got there fast, they got him out. So, oh, right. Clicking the wrong screen. Sorry. I have 3 different screens running simultaneously. Now, you need 4 ingredients if you're going to have an avalanche. All right? And these are actually very important because this is what we look for. When I train students to become avalanche technicians or avalanche forecasters, really, there's just 4 things they need to track and they need to know. And the first one is snow. Okay? This is going to sound painfully obvious, but if you really don't have much snow, you have very little avalanche hazard. And at what point do we say we've reached threshold? Avalanches are now a potential concern. There's some wiggle room here because it depends on the landscape. If you've got a very smooth, clean surface, like basically a field of grass, yeah, that can slide with relatively little snow. If you've got quite a large boulder field, there's a lot of different shapes in there, that's going to actually hold the snow in place up until it's all buried. If you've got a forest, trees act like anchors. And so if the trees are tight enough, they will hold the snow in place as well. All things being equal, once you start getting about 30 centimeters of snow on a smooth, planar feature, you can start thinking about avalanches. Okay? And for me, how I measure that, because I don't pull a ruler out when I go wandering around in the backcountry, as soon as the snow starts reaching sort of mid-calf on my leg, it's like, okay, it's deep enough now that I got to start thinking about potential avalanches. And again, if I'm in a really vulnerable position, like I'm out mountaineering or alpine climbing and I'm on a steep exposed slope on smooth rock, that can go pretty easy and I'm in a very delicate position, that could be a problem. If it's a tiny little roll, I'm on my skis and there's a nice big soft bench below me, I'm not so worried about it. So 30 centimeters is the starting point. But as I said, there's a lot of variations. And we use this to our advantage. If you know the prevailing wind direction, and the winds have literally scoured some of the ridges clear of snow, so long as there's not some large deposit of snow over your head, those are actually very safe places to travel. They're not much fun from a skiing perspective, but if you're climbing, that can be extremely valuable. Just be careful because as the snow blows off the ridge, it'll produce these big, large pillows of cornices, which are overhangs of snow. Those are dangerous. Stay off them on the edge of the rock, you're fine. If you're in an area where the snow has been scoured down so it's only 20-30 centimeters deep, you're on the windward or the slope that gets hit by the wind, so long as there isn't a big pillow of snow above you, that's pretty safe. So we can use this to our advantage. Oops. Okay. So our next ingredient is slope. And slope is really important. Okay? If you're traveling below 25 degrees, an avalanche might reach you if you're at the end of the avalanche path, but you're not going to trigger an avalanche under most circumstances. Once you get to 26 to 29, it's possible, but it's not very common. This is low-risk avalanche terrain for starting them. We could certainly run through there. 30 to 45 degrees is basically avalanche terrain. So as soon as the skiing starts to get really good, you should be worried. 35 to 40 is the perfect angle for an avalanche. Once you get above 45 degrees, the hazard actually drops significantly. And above 50 degrees, under most circumstances, it's just not steep enough. It's just too steep and the snow sloughs away and it doesn't build up into large destructive avalanches most of the time. It can happen on rare occasions. If you're in a coastal snowpack, that is, you're out by the coast, Alaska, off close to the ocean, these areas can produce much deeper snowpacks on steeper slopes, and in the right conditions, it could be a threat. The north face of Mount Robson is 60 degrees. I've seen it avalanche once in 30 years. It happens, but it's exceedingly rare. It's an unusual event, so unless you're seeing conditions that are far outside our normal, you're probably okay. Or you're approaching the north face and you drive your ice axe into it and there's 60 centimeters of fresh snow in there. Gee, that's really weird. Maybe I'll come back another day. But prime thing to remember is 30 to 45 degrees. 90% of all avalanche fatalities in Canada have occurred when the start zone, the place where it begins, is 30 to 45 degrees, and that's where the victim was. We tend to trigger our avalanches, or someone in our group triggers them and they land on us. It's not just slope though. It's also the shape of the slope. How are we doing? Okay. So here we have a slope. There we go. That's a planar slope. It's straight. As soon as we start to bend it, there we go. Then this is a convex roll. Now imagine this is a sheet of glass. And if I was to try and bend this, that's a huge amount of stress here on the bend, which means it's much more sensitive to potential triggering. And that is why convex rolls, we estimate about 1/3 of avalanche fatalities have occurred when the victim skied over a convexity on the slope, and under that stress, the snowpack failed. We'll talk a little more about the dynamics in a minute. The most stable of all three is the concave. So the slope is like this. Sorry. There we go. And what's happening is the weight of the snow is literally pushing into itself. So it's actually compressing the snowpack and potentially making it stronger. That doesn't mean it's safe. All things being equal, the convex roll is the first to fail. The planar is the second, and the concave is the third. They may all produce avalanches. All right? But the convex is by far the most sensitive. And the other thing that can produce avalanches is basically the roof line. So imagine this is the side of your house, and right here is the wall. And so now the snow is just hanging off into space. There's nothing supporting it. This is called an unsupported slope. So when it fails, it just slides right off because it's on the edge of a cliff or a steep transition in slope angle. And so that snowpack is not being held. Convex rolls, unsupported slopes, those are the big ones. Okay? Next. So slope is angle and shape. The third thing you have to have in a snowpack is a weak layer. Because if you have just a pile of snow and each layer is sticking to the other layer, we call that good skiing, good sledding, good riding. Right? This does happen. There are many times when it is safe to ski steep, aggressive terrain because there are no significant weak layers in the snowpack. And the way I like to describe this is I sort of equate this to glass. Snow on the short term can behave a lot like glass. It does not adjust to change well, and under stress it will fracture. It shatters. And so if we take a sheet of glass and we get another snowfall, so we have a new sheet of glass on top of it, if those two layers don't bond and you stick it at an angle, it's now under stress, it wants to go downhill. And what you've got is you've lined yourself up so that upper layer in the snowpack, if it reaches its weight, exceeds the snow's strength, it will fail. And as it settles, it gets stronger, and so it's much more likely to shatter or propagate. Okay, so why don't our windshields do that? We have safety glass in the front of our car. A rock hits the windshield, nothing happens. You get a crack and you're like, gotta replace the windshield. Something's gonna make you angry. But you know what? It doesn't. It doesn't shatter the whole sheet of glass and it falls into our lap. No. What's going on is you have a sheet of glass, sheet of plastic, sheet of glass, and then they heat it up and the two layers of glass are glued to that layer of plastic in between. So the outer layer of glass takes the hit, shatters, and it's held in place, glued to that next sheet of glass behind it. And that is what we're seeing with the layers in a snowpack. All right. So as long as this layer bonds to this layer in here, this is quite a defined layer, these two layers are sticking and the layers above are sticking, life is good. That's what we need to know. Do we have a weak layer? There's a lot of different types of weak layers, and I'm not going to get into them with a lot of detail because at the end of the day, you don't really need to know what that weak layer is. You just need to know, is it there? All right? I know it sounds like I'm sort of depriving you, but this is something we tend to talk about with the AST2. We talk about various crystals and the formation of weak layers. But I had this conversation with Bruce Jameson. And Bruce Jameson is, he's retired from the University of Calgary, but he was a professor there, and he worked in basically researching avalanches. And he fully agreed. A weak layer is a weak layer is a weak layer. Okay? That's what we need to know. Weak layers can be formed by new snow falling on the snowpack. They haven't had time to settle and stick to the layer below, so they're a bit touchy initially. They haven't settled and gotten really stiff, so they don't tend to produce big avalanches. But new snow on an old surface basically is a short-term weak layer. So the avalanche bulletin will reflect that. And probably make sure you stay off those features for a couple of days till it's had time to settle. Another one that you're going to hear a lot of is called a persistent weak layer. And persistent weak layers tend to form on the surface of the snow, and they're no problem there. But once they get buried, they're crystal type that simply doesn't bond well to the layers above and below it. And so whenever you have a long stretch of cold, clear weather, the crystals change and they facet out. Facets don't like to stick to layers above and below. So that's a weak layer, and it behaves like sand. Another weak layer is called surface hoar, and that's frost. Frost, if it doesn't evaporate, or sublimate is the proper term, through the action of wind or sun, it gets buried by another layer of snow. This behaves a bit like Teflon, and it's a really smooth, easy layer to fail. It prevents the layer above and the layer below from bonding. So these are problems. How they're formed can be a bit complicated, but at the end of the day, all I look for as a guide are the answers to 3 questions. Do I have a weak layer? Can I trigger it? And what is the worst that's going to happen to me if I do? And by doing that, I very quickly can figure out whether or not it's reasonable to be where I am. I don't like going into the math and the science of snow when I'm guiding, for the simple reason it's so easy to take this information and distort it or twist it to fit the model of the world I want to see. It's so much simpler and cleaner for me anyways to just say, do I have a weak layer? Can I trigger it? If I get 2 yeses, I have to be really careful. Okay. So, new snow instability, persistent weak layer, the deep persistent slab. Okay, so this is actually a deep persistent weak layer. These things are very cool, but you know what? They're kind of hard to describe because they're not something we would expect right off the bat. A deep persistent weak layer starts at the bottom of your snowpack. So let's pull up a snowpack here. There's our deep persistent weak layer. And how these are formed, so the persistent weak layer is formed when new snow falls on top of a sliding layer, and new snow on old snow is a short-term problem. Also, blowing snow can create a short-term problem too. But that weak layer at the very bottom of your snowpack, called a deep persistent weak layer, happens because it's been really cold, there's not a lot of snow on the ground, and the heat from the earth is rising through the snowpack, and the crystals are literally changing. They're metamorphosing through the movement of moisture up from the bottom of the snowpack. Have you ever punched through the snowpack at the ski hill, reached the bottom, pulled out the snow, and literally just poured it like sugar? Sugar snow. Those are facets and or depth hoar. What that means is you have large crystals that do not bond. It's gravel, sand, or ball bearings. Take your pick. But that's how they behave. And they will form over time at the bottom of your snowpack. What you want to feel ideally is a snowpack that just gets stiffer and stiffer and stiffer and stiffer as you push through the snow. If you're in the Columbias, sort of between Golden and Kamloops, maybe not quite that far west, but that general area, you'll probably feel that fairly often, but not always, at least half the time. If you're on the coast, that's the norm. It starts easy and just keeps getting stiffer and stiffer and stiffer, but not always, because it's weather-based. In the Rockies, rarely do we have that kind of a snowpack. You're almost always starting soft, getting stiffer, 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 then boof, soft, because the Rockies have the coldest and the driest snowpack. So we have the least amount of snow, the most amount of cold, and this weak layer is just almost a fact of life here every year. So those are your basic weak layers. The other thing we call a persistent weak layer is a weak basal layer. Okay? Crusts can form weak layers immediately or after a while. They're usually start on the surface and then they get buried. So they're called a persistent weak layer. I'm not going to go much more into it. For the simple reason, when I'm guiding, that's all I try to function with my brain. Do I have that weak layer? Identifying it is more important. So now, if we have snow and we have a slope between 30 and 45 degrees and a weak layer, particularly a weak layer that's less than a meter from the surface, we just need one more ingredient, and that's us, triggers. And a trigger is anything that adds weight or reduces the strength of that upper snowpack. So things with weight are triggers. Anybody know what the leading cause of death is for mountain goats? It's avalanches. They jump on the slope, their weight exceeds the snowpack strength, and off they go. And it's really too bad for the goats because I'm rather fond of mountain goats. But if you're a grizzly bear, this is fantastic because the goat gets buried, covered by a ton of snow, and then come spring when it melts out, that's actually an important food source for grizzly bears, particularly female with new cubs. And so they're kind of like frozen TV dinners. It's a little hard on the goat, but the bears sure appreciate it. Now, the other thing that can trigger an avalanche is something that reduces strength. So the snowpack gets a lot of heat and it starts to melt. So this is the way I like to describe the trigger. Imagine you've got a bridge. And this is actually fairly close to what we're actually dealing with when we're talking about avalanches. And this bridge is designed to hold 100 cars. Okay? We got a 100-car bridge here, and it's rush hour, so there's 90 cars on the bridge. The bridge is under a fair bit of stress, but it's not going to break yet. Then, the local cycling club with 50 riders rides right down the middle in between all the cars. 50 riders don't quite equate to 10 cars, but that's really close. And then, the local hiking club is using the pedestrian lane on that bridge. And all of a sudden, we are just a hair shy of what that bridge can hold. So finally, some clown on a unicycle rides in with the traffic, and boom, the bridge collapses. All right? The clown was the trigger, but it took 90 cars, 50 cyclists, and the hiking club to get us to the tipping point. All right? So that's the trigger, was the clown. And what we do is we look at the weak layers and we try to assess what do we think is the tipping point. And that's what we're trying to calculate when we determine whether or not a slope is reasonable to cross. You know, you want good margins. You don't want to be riding around on a suspect bridge in a unicycle. Now, let's go back to our bridge, shall we? There's 90 cars on it and nothing else. Good. Nice solid bridge. Let's take that bridge, and now that clown on his unicycle is going to ride out. No problem. He's on the pedestrian zone, on the edge of the bridge where all the steel beams are. This clown has gotten a acetylene torch and cuts through one of the braces, and so bing! Suddenly the bridge can only hold 95 cars. And that clown with his acetylene torch cuts through another steel beam. Boom! And all of a sudden, that bridge can barely hold 90 cars. And just as the clown starts cutting the third beam, the whole thing collapses. And that's what happens when you add heat. So when the sun comes out and the energy starts getting into the upper snowpack, it's literally breaking the bonds in that snow and making it weaker. That's your clown with a torch. And at some point during the day, there may be enough damage to that snowpack that it can no longer support its own weight and it fails. So at 7 a.m., before the sunrise, that snowpack was more than strong enough and perfectly safe to ski. But by 3 in the afternoon in spring, it's observed so much heat on those south and west aspects that the heat has literally created a situation where the snowpack is just waiting for that one clown, and the whole thing will rip out. So those are the two things that can serve as a trigger. Now there's one thing that will actually affect both weight and strength, and that's rain. When it rains, you're adding weight to the snowpack, just as if you were adding snow or a skier. Water has huge amounts of energy, and so as it trickles through the snowpack, it is literally cutting the bonds holding the snow together. And you like to think, well, it's cold rain, it can't do that much damage, but water at 0 degrees contains 80 times more energy than ice at 0 degrees. So a cold drop of water can actually break down a lot of ice. And as a result, if you're in the backcountry, especially if you're in the Rockies or the Columbias, and it's starting to rain, if it's more than a few drops, you should be thinking the avalanche hazard is doing this. It's going up fast. Get out of avalanche terrain or hunker down in a safe spot until things stop and the snowpack has time to refreeze and heal. So rain is really bad. If you're on the coast, it rains every second day. Still the same problem, but you might have a stronger snowpack to begin with, so you have a little more margin. But it's a very safe rule of thumb. Do not stick your neck out when it's raining. Find a safe place to hide. Okay, how are we doing, folks? People have been very quiet so far. No questions? Okay. So everyone's got that? 4 ingredients. Sorry, just trying to figure out where the card is, where the camera is. 4 ingredients for an avalanche. You got to have snow. You got to have the right slope. You got to have a weak layer in the snowpack, and you have to have a trigger. If you're missing any one of those ingredients, you're not going to have an avalanche. All right. And so that's what we do as avalanche forecasters, as guides, people working in the industry. They're looking for that combination. Now, there's different types of avalanches. We basically have them classified into two broad categories and then another set of subcategories within that. The first one's called a loose snow avalanche. And a loose snow avalanche, if you look at this, it's starting from the rocks. It's starting from hot points in the snowpack. They're getting more energy. And why do you think this is making a difference? Okay. What I'm going to do is I am going to break my previous rule about not talking about crystals, and I'm going to show you. See if I can find this. I just rewrote this book, so oh wow, perfect. Crystals change. See these? These are snowflakes that have been outside for a little while. When you get a snowflake, it's a big, there we go, six-sided crystal if you get a perfect snowflake, perfect dendrite, and it's got a lot of surface area. Now, solids can change to gases without ever becoming a liquid. It's called sublimation. Water does this pretty neatly. And so on these big, long surface areas, basically some water vapor will escape, and the snowflake gets thinner and thinner until it literally starts to break up into little pieces. And these are sublimated snowflakes. You can see how they've kind of rounded a bit, but also they're missing their arms. So that nice Velcro snowpack is gone. And what you're left with are just shards of ice. They should not be rounding. Let's see what we got here. Okay, I'm going to go back 2 pages. There we go. Here's a little animation I produced to try and describe the process of sublimation. So here's our snowflake. As it falls through the atmosphere and or lays on the ground, water vapor literally begins to break it to pieces. And we go from being sort of those nice big snowflakes that are kind of like Velcro to just little shards of ice. And this is basically a time lapse, and you can see how the snow is settling as new snow falls on top. It's literally turning into little bits and fragments of ice. Those little bits and fragments are unstable. So, when you have those little bits of unstable ice, what you have sitting on your snowpack is basically sand. They've gone from snowflakes to grains of material very much like sand. And so there's no cohesive strength. And the steeper you tip them, the less stable they are, and they begin to slough. These crystals will decompose and become unstable even faster if they're warmed up. And that is why they're all starting from these dark rocks. The rocks have absorbed heat, which is basically accelerating the process of these crystals to break down. And then once they begin to move, just like when you build a sandcastle with dry sand, and you kind of touch the edge and the whole thing just sort of slides down, that's a loose snow avalanche. Loose snow avalanche, slough, or point release. Same thing. And this tends to happen really only during 2 times. During the storm and just afterwards, the snow, as it decomposes, becomes unstable and starts to slide down in sloughs. So you'll see this. You'll also see it when things warm up. When it's late in the spring, as it was when this photograph was taken, there was enough heat that the entire snowpack had turned from a fairly solid snowpack to something that resembled a slushy. All the bonds in the snow were gone. They were just these round blobs of ice with a little bit of water around them. And so it just took a tiny little bit of heat and then something to start moving, and the whole snowpack just went slushing down the mountain. So periods of intense heat when the snow, we call it isothermal, but really it's just this warm, mushy, slushy snow. Okay? Can happen during rain. Rain can basically break down the bonds, and the upper snowpack can slide as a slush, but it can also produce slab avalanches, which are much more destructive. And then during and just after storms. Okay? I actually have a video I'm going to pull up for you. This is a slough avalanche just towards the end of a storm that I was guiding in. Oops. Okay. Shall we play it? I'll keep the audio off. So I saw this coming off the north face of Mount Victoria, and we're actually several kilometers away, so we're in no threat of the debris reaching us. But it was just a big loose snow avalanche caused because it had been snowing and there'd been a bit of wind allowing it to pile up on the sheltered or lee slope. And you can just see this big powder cloud coming towards us. And I'm not sure how the guests were feeling. I think they were a little nervous. But they couldn't run away because they were tied to me on a rope, and I wasn't going anywhere. I knew we were okay, and the last thing I wanted to do was have people running around in an area full of crevasses. Okay. So, as you can see, really it was just snowflakes coming at us when the powder cloud actually hit us. Generally a low consequence event, but not always. Imagine you're skiing and there's a big cliff below you. A small loose avalanche could knock you off your feet, and literally you could roll off down slope and off the edge of the cliff. They can hit with enough force that you're knocked into a crevasse, and then it just fills them up and you're buried deep. And there are situations where you can see very large destructive loose snow avalanches. And this still is a good example because the sidewall, this feature along the side here, the trim line, is actually over 2 meters high. So while it was easy to identify that this could occur under these temperatures, if you were unlucky enough to be here when this happened, that's going to hit you like wet cement. All right. So that's a pretty good little rundown on loose snow avalanches. Let's check this one out. This is the one we all watch out for, the slab. So we have snow, we have slope, there's a weak layer in the snowpack. That explosive was our trigger. And explosives are very effective triggers. They're not 100% effective, but they are very effective triggers. See how it just fractured from side to side? Literally like a sheet of glass. And now as it comes down the mountain, it continues to accelerate, build speed. This would be a fairly powerful, potentially fairly devastating avalanche. Fortunately, it's now rolling uphill because this thing went much bigger than the photographer was expecting. I wasn't here. And they got hit with a powder cloud, but by none of the avalanche debris. Okay, so that's our slab avalanche. That's the one we tend to focus on the most because it tends to be the most destructive. It's also the one that requires the most effort to try and forecast because it can be a lot trickier. So, avalanches come in sizes. And I'm going to let one of my instructors, when I went through the process, and one of the founders of the Canadian Avalanche Foundation, Chris.
The size, we talk about the Canadian Avalanche Danger Scale professionally when we're talking about size, and that's really what's behind the public avalanche bulletin as well. We start with size 1, which is an avalanche which isn't considered dangerous to people on foot most of the time. Still dangerous to an ice climber who's going to fall off and take a nasty fall. Size 2, which would bury a skier, person on foot. Size 3, which would bury a vehicle. Size 4, which might bury a railway train or take out a house. And a size 5, which might take out a whole village or a large area of forest.
Thank you. So you should have my audio now. I apologize. I have to keep switching tracks back and forth, and I missed that. Okay, we'll try this again. Thanks for catching me, guys. For a size 1 avalanche is really only looking at, maybe 20 centimeters of snow that's failed, and it's enough to push you around or basically knock you off your feet. I've been caught in plenty of size 1 avalanches. Sometimes I do that deliberately to actually test a small feature to see if I want to step onto a larger slope. But I only do this if I know my landing is really soft and safe. Getting caught in a size 1 avalanche, if you're close to the edge of a cliff, can literally cause you to fall to your death. Near a crevasse, well, if you fall in the crevasse, if wedging in the crevasse doesn't kill you, the snow piling up on top of you probably will. Getting slammed into a tree may not be fatal, but it can definitely ruin your day. Same thing with a rock. So consider your landscape, but a size 1 is considered, relatively harmless to people. Size 2. A size 2 is large enough to bury and kill you. Doesn't take that big of an avalanche to qualify as a size 2. This can be just, a nice little pocket in the trees. You're skiing some steep trees. All of a sudden it opens up, and lo and behold, you can make 8 turns, and you don't have to worry about hitting a tree. That could produce an avalanche of significant mass, to cause you to be buried. So these are the ones to really watch. They're relatively small features. They can be sneaky. A size 3 is quite large. It's enough to basically bury and destroy a car. When you look at the big avalanche paths running down mountains, you see the trim lines, you see how the trees are missing. Often from the top to the bottom of the mountain is a size 3. If most of the trees on that side of the mountain are missing, then it's probably a size 4. Size 4 can basically take out an entire terrain. And a size 5, we used to say we've never seen a size 5 in Canada, but that's because we weren't reporting it properly. So we've gotten back and readjusted our scales, and now we're saying we do see size 5s in Canada. They're very large. Basically the entire mountain, top to bottom, has released in a very significant avalanche. Tremendous amount of force. You don't need to start splitting hairs between, well, was that a large size 3 or a small size 4? It was a big avalanche. That's what matters. As soon as you get into size 3s, they're really big features. And if you're below tree line, there's usually good landscape features to tell you that there's a reason there's no trees here for the next 2 minutes as you ski across it. Yeah. So we try to standardize our sizes, because otherwise they just become fish stories. And if you almost got caught, every year the avalanche gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Whereas once you pin it down to a size 2, you have to call it a size 2. Avalanches can also be wet and dry, and it's exactly as it sounds. If the avalanche is dry, they tend to move faster. They can go up to even exceed 130 kilometers an hour. They'll produce powder clouds, and they are the fastest of the avalanches. A wet avalanche, this is zoomed in, so it looks like it's moving fast, but they move a lot slower. They also produce no powder clouds. And a wet avalanche is only going to occur if temperatures are above 0 and have been for a while, and or it's been raining. Wet avalanches tend to be more dense, so they can be quite destructive, but they generally don't move as fast. All right, I won't get into that too much more. But we do like to talk about the avalanche path. So the area where the avalanche starts is the start zone. And the start zone is almost always 30 to 45 degrees. Now there's variations to that. They can be steeper, they can be less, but it's a good reference. Now the track is usually 30 degrees or less. And this is where the avalanche maintains or accelerates its speed. And then where it starts to slow down and the debris accumulates is called, there we are, down there, when the avalanche is about to come to a stop. That's the run out. Now, usually we're looking in the run out if we have someone buried in an avalanche, but not always. Sometimes they're actually hung up on debris or in pockets of snow in the track. And avalanches don't always start from the top and go all the way to the bottom. Let me pull up a still for that. Here we are. So if this whole upper feature here, wait a second, let me try it this way. If this whole upper feature here fails and runs all the way to the bottom, that's a full path or climax avalanche. Simple. But what happens if just this pocket fails and it comes to about here? That would be about a half path avalanche. And we will use those phrases, full path, half path, because it gives us an idea of avalanche activity, its frequency when you see multiple avalanches, and its potential size. If it's early season or the weak layer is close to the surface, they might be producing much smaller avalanches that don't go full path. So that's good information. Come spring, however, once the heat starts getting through the snowpack, if we see an avalanche cycle, they often produce full path avalanches. And sometimes they exceed the historical runout, and they'll actually start breaking large timber at the base. And so when we see that, forecasters and researchers will go in and they'll look at the trees, and they'll count the tree rings, and they'll look at their age relative to the other trees in the area. And this helps them to look at the situation, and using a couple of other tools, but that's a good reference, they can start to say, well, this looks like this might have been the 1 in 50-year avalanche, because it took out timber that was about 50 years old. Or ideally, you find a big tree that survived multiple hips, then you cut it down, poor thing, and you look at the scars that have occurred on the bark, and you might actually say, well, this has happened 4 times in the last 200 years. Okay, so this is sort of a 1 in 50-year event. Because avalanches are like floods. You have basically annual flow, 1 in 5-year event, 1 in 10-year, 1 in 20, 1 in 50, 1 in 100, 1 in 400, 1 in 1,000. And in Canada, we're just starting to get a pretty good handle on calculating sort of what we can expect for historical paths and, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000-year avalanches. But we don't have solid data to back us up. We're using mathematical models. By contrast, in Switzerland, they have 700 years worth of data. They've been tracking this for a long time. We just started keeping good records since 1960. That's not 700 years. So as a result, we have a lot more trouble calculating this. And so sometimes we get surprised because an avalanche will occur. This happened in 1987. Upper slopes failed. They took out the forest below it. And the age of the trees were such that in the coroner's inquiry, it was determined that this was the 1 in 400-year avalanche. And 4 people sitting in heavy timber having lunch were killed. And I remember Chris Stetham, who was involved with the analysis, saying in class, you know what? I would have done the same thing. He didn't see the threat above either because it was such mature forest. So keep in mind, avalanches, we have a pretty good handle, but when things start getting out of hand, and this is where the avalanche danger scale kicks in, you can expect greater and greater variability. And you'll find that information in the bulletin. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Remember, start zone, track, and run out. If you jump in the start zone, you can trigger the avalanche. If you jump around in the track, you've got very little time to run if it goes naturally. And if you're in the run out, it's going to have to be a big avalanche, basically running full path, and either you're not going to be able to see it coming because it's such a bad storm, or you're going to see what's going on and you'll have time to make a move to get out of there. Okay. The other thing we look at is aspect. An aspect is basically where the sun shines. So in the morning, the east aspect gets the sun. The south gets sun almost all day long, and the west gets the afternoon sun. So the south and the west get the most heat. As a result, in early winter, south and west tend to settle and stabilize faster. But come spring, they get the most heat, and they tend to become the most unstable first. Also, the colder temperatures found on east and north aspects tend to produce weaker crystals. So again, early season, you're looking at a weaker snowpack and greater potential for avalanche. That's a very broad statement with everything else being equal. But aspect is very significant, both for sun and also the wind. Okay. So you can see here's another function of aspect. So, right in here, this is a north aspect. This is getting into more of a northwest. It's late afternoon. This is a north aspect. It's very cold in here. The winds have been blowing from the south. They've been blowing snow, and they've been filling up this slope, which is why it looks like such a fat, juicy, sweet ski line. It's exactly where you want to go skiing. And as a guide, one of the rules of thumb I always adhere to is if it's where you really want to go skiing, it's probably an avalanche slope. Doesn't mean you can't ski it, but you'd better make sure it's stable. And so this is all a function of aspect. It gets very little sun, north aspect, and the winds are blowing, creating these cornices and loading the slopes down below. So there's a lot of weight. If you have weak layers in here, they're under a lot more weight and probably closer to going. Bummer, eh? Get used to it. That's sort of the world about the avalanche. So I'll tell you what, guys. Actually, you guys are just watching. By all means, go grab a drink or have dinner throughout this course. But I'm going to go clear my throat. And I'm going to let Ilya had the perfect name as an avalanche forecaster. He was in charge of the forecasting program for Avalanche Canada, where you go to get the bulletin. And just the sweetest man you'd ever meet. I have great respect for him. He was kind enough to sit down and basically describe the Avalanche Bulletin that we as the public have access to.
So the flagship product for Avalanche Canada in many ways is the public avalanche forecast. It gets issued daily, and it's really challenging in some ways because we're trying to do many different things. We're trying to provide a product that serves all kinds of people. And that is both people who have minimum avalanche training all the way to people who have professional level skills and experience and knowledge. We're trying to provide something that will help everybody who's going out in the mountains. And the way we do that is we break the forecast into 2 pages. Page 1, there's dates, date that it was issued, and the expiry date. It's really important to make sure that you always have the latest information. Below that, we have a headline. And the headline is a way to really help you focus on what I, as a forecaster, think is the most important thing. Below the headline, we have our danger ratings, which is a sort of a one-word summary of the hazard that's out there. And we do that for 3 elevation bands, the alpine, tree line, and below tree line. And then we also provide a confidence statement. Avalanche forecasts are built on weather forecasts, and there's uncertainty. Sometimes we get it wrong. So we try to tell you what our confidence is and why. Sometimes it's because of the forecast just doesn't have a lot of data. We're a little data sparse. Sometimes it's because there's a lot of uncertainty about the timing or the track or the intensity of the weather. So we try to help you by revealing what our confidence is in our forecast. I think avalanche problems are a really powerful part of the forecast because in just a short word or two, persistent weak layer, persistent slab, wind slab, storm slab, those words are shorthand for a very rich concept. We provide information for what elevation band we think that this is a problem. We identify the likelihood of an occurrence, the likelihood of triggering an avalanche, as well as the size. So it's more information than a simple danger rating, but by giving you more and more detailed information, it empowers people to make better decisions. We're able to start steering people to take specific steps to help manage that risk, to help manage that problem. So that's the information that's on the front page. If you go to the second page, the forecast details page, you'll find 3 sections. The weather forecast, a summary of what the best forecast for that region. The second section there is a snowpack description. That's where we sort of dissect the snowpack, talk about layers, talk about the architecture of the snowpack, which for people with more training, more knowledge, more experience, it gives them more detailed information to better understand and assess the likely conditions that they're going to find in the field. And possibly the most important part of the forecast is the avalanche occurrence section. That's where we can really add value, because if we go back to the professional exchange of information, we're able to build a picture of where avalanches are running, what kind of avalanches. My friend Jill Fredson always says that avalanches are like fish. They swim in schools. So when we can start identifying patterns of elevation, aspect, size, how far they're running, what's triggering them, we can impart that, we can communicate that, and past avalanches are one of the best ways to predict future avalanches. All this information is really seeking to do probably one thing, and that is to help you match terrain to the conditions.
So the bulletin is constantly evolving. They're always changing it. And this is because as technology improves and as our forecasting skills improve, we want to bring that across to the public. So there's been a few changes. I'm just going to pull them up. So here we are. This is Avalanche Canada's site. Stay connected with our newsletter. Search places. Oh, this is completely new from what I'm used to. And oh, the Gord Ritchie Service Award. Gord Ritchie. Gord's a pretty amazing individual. So okay, how do I get this down? I don't know how to get rid of this. Yeah, North American Danger Scale. Okay, so you can now type in the place you're looking for, which is nice because it gives you a little more control. But you'll also see, and unfortunately I've just got this tiny little space to work with, they have just changed it again. But you'll see that they're broken down into regions. And depending on where you are, you can see the region. So let's go with, I think this is the Purcells here. I'll go into the Purcells in just a second. But yeah, I'll do that. Let's go into the Purcells. Click on this. And I have to work within this box. Let me see. I'm just going to get out of this ebook, and I'm going to get onto Avalanche Canada's webpage independently. Okay. There we go. Wow, they're covering some big terrain here. There we go. Now we've zoomed in, we can see what we're doing. So they've got some cities in here for reference, but let's go check on the Purcells. Okay, that's an area I used to spend a lot of time in. So here's the Avalanche Bulletin. It's valid December 26th until basically 1700, so that's 5 p.m. Prepared by Avalanche Canada. Okay. So they're saying rocky, wind-affected areas are a prime suspect for large human-triggered avalanches. That's not good. Seek out sheltered, moderate-angled slopes for the best and safest riding. So they've given us good information right off the bat about where we can go and what we should do. Okay, this is really nice. Why do you think it's thin spots? It's because the weak layer. Why can't I? It won't let me in. This is really weird. Oh, I see. Okay, so the thin spots are where it's easiest to trigger the weak layer. So we have 3 danger zones. We have the alpine, which is basically no trees. Tree line is where the trees are transitioning from being a dense forest to being a much more open landscape. So while it looks like a third of the mountain on this map, it's actually just a narrow band between the alpine and below tree line. It's not this huge reacher. And my definition of tree line is if I ski from where there's no trees and then I start seeing trees, so long as I don't have to think about hitting them, I'm in tree line. So I'm just skiing along, having the time of my life, and oh, there was a tree. Oh, there was another one. And life is good. Okay, and then when I go, whoa, stop, trees, turn left, turn right. Okay, tuck, look out, turn, turn, turn. Think 3 turns ahead so you don't hit a tree. I'm below tree line. That's the way I figure it out. Just, are the trees so dense that I'm trying to avoid trauma? Okay, we're below tree line. Are the trees really just these beautiful little things I ski by as I go full tilt? That's tree line. And when I'm worried about trauma, that's below tree line. So our rating is 3, 2, 1. Considerable, moderate, low. Okay. We'll talk about what each one of those means in a minute. Okay, so Saturday, they're expecting the same. And on Sunday, things may become a bit more stable because the snowpack has had time to bond. Avoid freshly wind-loaded features, especially near ridge crests, rollovers, and in steep terrain. Okay, rollovers. Another name for a rollover? Convex roll. There's your terrain feature to worry about. And in steep terrain. If triggered, wind slab avalanches may step down to deeper layers, resulting in larger avalanches. What that means is there's more than one weak layer in the snowpack. And if you trigger the first one, it might actually trigger a deeper layer, which means a bigger avalanche. So the first problem is wind slab. I'll show you what a wind slab is in a minute. But it's caused by wind. So the wind is blowing this way from the southwest, and it's blowing all the snow off this side of the mountain. This is a compass, but you can think of it as a mountain. So we're blowing all the snow off this side of the mountain and depositing it on these sides, which means we're loading them. They're getting more weight. So those weak layers they're worried about are getting more weight on them. Plus, just the act of blowing snow across can produce a short-term problem called wind slab, which can produce avalanches. Okay, and as I said, hang on, I'll tell you what a wind slab is. This is a little meters telling you unlikely, possible, likely, very likely, certain. So you have to be careful. Likely does not mean it's better than 50-50. But it does mean that if you're going to go wandering around in the mountains and you're just going to randomly jump on stuff, you're probably not going to make it through the winter without triggering an avalanche on these areas of concern when the hazard is likely. And you're going to produce a size 1 to a small size 2 avalanche. That's your sizes here. If we say very likely, the hazard is probably high because human-triggered avalanches are very easy in many places. And when we say certain, the avalanche hazard is high or extreme. And this is a snowpack that probably is a good time to stay out of. If you are going to ski or travel when that hazard is that high, then you need to move through terrain that basically has no history of avalanches. Okay. Fresh reactive wind slabs exist in lee and cross-loaded areas from yesterday's and today's snowfall and wind. Okay, that was the first problem. The second problem is a persistent slab. So that's a persistent weak layer. And it's everywhere. Okay, bummer. Not as easy to trigger, but it can produce avalanches up towards size 3. So that's pretty big. In the mid, snowpack buried surface ore. It's a weak layer, long-term weak layer, or facets. Okay, they're not sure which one you're going to find. They're both bad. They're a persistent weak layer. That's all I need to know. May pose a risk on north-facing slopes. This is why aspect is such useful information, because it'll tell you which slopes you're more likely to find this problem. However, on the southern slopes, the sunny slopes, there's a buried sun crest, which could be reactive in south-facing slopes. But this is a secondary concern. The primary concern is the weak layer in the dark shaded slopes. This crust might be starting to become a problem and might actually get worse over time. Crusts sometimes take time to form weak layers. And then in shallow snowpack area, the cold, loose snow at the bottom of the snowpack is generally weak. And then in their summary, on Tuesday they had a large skier-triggered avalanche that indicated reactive wind slabs failing on the deeper weak layer. Is a significant issue in the alpine and at tree line, hence the hazard of being 3 and 2. On Wednesday, explosive control near Invermere, so this was probably highways, maybe heli skiing, produced size 1 avalanches on persistent weak layers from steep tree-lined terrain. Okay. Both these avalanche problems will continue into Friday. Steep, rocky, wind-loaded areas are prime suspects for either of these instabilities. Okay. Down here, they'll give you the snowpack summary. I'm not going to go into that. That's probably a little more than you want to take on your first avalanche course, but read it. Go through them, because you know what? Over time, you'll start to understand the terminology, and you'll see the same worries repeating, and you'll start to understand that these are persistent weak layers. 5 to 20 centimeters of new snow has fallen in the past 24 hours, and that explains the wind slab. Accompanying southwest winds have likely redistributed. That's why they're so worried about the wind. The wind has taken the snow and moved it and loaded some areas so that it has even more snow. But it also changes the crystal. And then the deeper weak layer found 20 to 90 centimeters, so well inside the range that it's triggerable by humans. Doesn't matter what the crystals are, but you have a weak layer down 20 to 90. So when that goes, it can produce a very significant avalanche, more than enough to kill you. Okay. So there's your basic information. And let's get back to the book. I've talked a lot about wind slabs, so I should tell you what a wind slab is. Here we are, advanced skills. So, we have had quite a conversation within my industry, the snow geeks, about the difference between a wind slab and a storm slab. So when snow first falls from the sky and lands on the ground, we now call that a storm slab because it occurred during a snowstorm. Even if there's wind affecting that snow, we call it a storm slab. However, as soon as the wind stops, as soon as the snow stops, if the wind continues to move that snow around, it is now becoming a wind slab. And this is why we're worried about wind slabs. And, wind slab. Oh, I like this. And the first thing is you need to understand is terminology. So the slope that is being hit by the wind is the windward slope. The slope where the snow is being deposited, piling up, is the lee slope. Okay? Now, take that information and apply it. So we got some pretty strong winds here, and it's redistributing the snow. This is wind slab. And wind slab, actually most snow is carried close to the surface of the snow. Within the first 2 meters, most of it drags along the surface. So as it gets dragged along the surface, the crystals literally break up into pieces, and then they deposit on the sheltered or lee slope. This is how cornices are formed, and this is the wind slab down here. These tiny little shards of ice can actually, can actually settle and bond into a stiff snowpack very, very fast. And because they're stiff and they're brittle, and they may not yet have had time to bond to that layer below them, they're a potential weak layer. But they tend to be short-lived, and that's why the hazard is dropping after Saturday. Because the temperatures are warm and we don't keep getting the loading, the snow will settle and bond to the old snow surface, and that problem will disappear. But until that time, you should be concerned. And it's where you've got all that nice snow you want to go skiing. So this is how it sounds when you walk on a wind slab. And this is a very extreme example, so please Don't think that all wind slab sounds like this. Really dense wind slab sounds. So it's that stiff styrofoam sound that's sort of the classic wind slab. It can be a lot more subtle and it can even ski pretty nicely. But that's what a wind slab is. And those are really significant short-term problems after a storm, or if you have a landscape where you've got lots of loose powdery snow and then the winds come up and they just start blowing it and the snow gets busted up and deposited into those sheltered pockets or slopes. The sheltered features are lee, the slopes getting scoured are the windward. And let me see if I have cross-loading, because that was mentioned too. Cross-loading, how do you about that? I did make a video. So these are actually really deep gullies, but the wind's been blowing across this slope and has filled up the gullies. And that too will create basically a wind slab. In fact, there's a natural avalanche right here. That's been caused by wind blowing across. And so along the ridges, it's thin and shallow. You're likely to trigger something, but it's not going to be very big. And then when you get farther out into where the gullies are, you're actually walking over into a very deep section of snow that could be triggered from those shallow pockets you were just in. All right. Does that make sense? Oh. What is the likelihood of avalanches that get monitored triggered by firearms in resorts, for example? Okay, Jamie. So when we do avalanche control, we use explosives. And for something like a ski hill, we can use relatively small charges that we can carry in our packs. We measure them in 1 kilogram, 2 kilogram, and 5 kilogram hand charges. And literally, we put them in our hand, we light them, and we throw them. Okay, those are hand charges. Then we have larger explosives, and this can be bags of diesel-soaked fertilizer called AMPHO. And AMPHO generally come in about 15 to 25 kilogram bags. And so these have to be put into position, lit, and then you leave or dropped out of helicopters. Not so much for ski hills, but certainly for highway operations, that's a very active part of the program. Something like a handgun or a rifle probably isn't going to trigger an avalanche just because it doesn't disturb the snow enough. Under absolutely ideal conditions, yeah, it could. But you're not going to see people jumping up and down and shouting, triggering an avalanche. Jumping on the slope might, and explosives simulate an energy. They transmit a huge amount of energy, like weight, into the snowpack, and that is a very effective trigger. So those we do use, but basically, while theoretically it's possible, if the avalanche is on such a fine line that you could trigger it with a handgun, then or a firearm, at least the ones that we have access to, then you're probably at a situation where the avalanche hazard is in the high to extreme range, and we would have already recommended stay out of avalanche terrain. I hope that answers your question. Oh, do we still use howitzers at Rogers Pass? Yes. They still use the 105 in Rogers Pass. And they finally found a pretty secure source for the shells, because the weapon was built in the Korean War, and they almost had to close the program because they couldn't find any shells anymore. But they have come up with a resource, I understand. Having said that, Rogers Pass is moving away from that. They haven't stopped it, but they're putting in more and more really advanced control systems where they actually have explosives that are either set up before the winter, and they're in certain containers and then sort of launched out, land on the snowpack and detonate, or they're using things like propane, which they actually bleed into the snow and then light, and literally the snowpack blows up from underneath. All sorts of very amazing things, and they're even putting in some structures that prevent the snow from avalanching. They're just simply fences. And while it sounds very simple, putting them in place is a surprisingly challenging engineering feat, because you're putting a fence where really you've just got a series of low angle cliffs. Yeah, but it's all very cool. And if you're as a young man, I thought it was sort of your dream job. You get paid to ski out of bounds and blow things up. I thought that was very cool. However, if you want to be able to make enough money to raise a family and own a home someday, then it gets a little tougher. Okay, let me get back to where we were. The bulletin. Bulletin. Okay. Okay, so as you saw, we have the alpine, tree line, and below tree line. Don't get hung up on the elevation bands, because the truth is it's highly variable and it's changing. With climate change, tree line is rising everywhere. And with the change in our water regimes, that too is having a real impact on where it is. But keep in mind, if you're down on the valley floor and it's full of trees, and all of a sudden as you're skiing, this big swath opens up in front of you, look around. That's probably a slide path, especially if it works its way right up into the alpine. And while the hazard might be low below tree line, you are directly exposed to that alpine feature. And so unless the hazard is sort of shooting through the roof, you might say, okay, let's just move quickly through the space and keep on our way. But you are potentially exposed to that feature above. Whereas if you're in dense timber, the only thing that's going to get you is the 1 in 200, 1 in 400 year avalanche, maybe. And so the chances of you being the next person getting caught in an avalanche of those magnitudes at that frequency, it's right up there with the lottery ticket. So, you know, I comfortably travel in that kind of terrain with my family when the avalanche hazard is high. So long as I know I've got good, mature timber around me, it's like the odds of this, I'm so much safer than driving on the highway. But look around you. They're not fixed references. Okay, here's something I missed. Let's get us back here. So I keep talking about low, moderate, considerable, high, and extreme. We have two rating systems. They're the same. Okay? For everything you're doing and for 90% of what I do, I can basically use these two systems interchangeably. There's a few times when I have to start splitting hairs, but you know what? It's rare, and it just takes me another few seconds to adjust. Low is 1, moderate is 2, considerable is 3, high is 4, and extreme is 5. We use basically the same system as the Europeans. And Canada and the United States use the identical system. The reason they're using numbers in Europe, in part, especially for the public system, is because if you speak different languages, we all use the same numbers. So if you only speak English and you're in Italy, skiing through the Italian Alps, and you see a bulletin that you can't read, but you see a red box with the number 4 in it, you know that's high. If it's green and a 1, you know it's low. That's the idea. Now, as a professional, we don't use the words, we use the numbers, 1 through 5. And each designation does sort of define very precise elements that we will look at, and frequency, size, and distribution of avalanches are also connected to this. That's not something we need to worry too much about at the recreational level, because they all sort of combine in a very reasonable and logical manner. So, the avalanche hazard is low. This is generally safe terrain. What this means is size 1 avalanches are possible, size 2 avalanches in fairly extreme terrain. So if you're basically going out and skiing the kind of terrain 90% of us love to ski, the chances of you triggering an avalanche are very low. If you're an alpinist and you're climbing up high and you've got some small 45-degree slopes that you've got to climb in between pitches, yeah, that's possible, and that would be devastating because as an alpinist, you're just going to get launched off into the air. It's still a concern. If you're an extreme skier and you're going to start skiing really steep, aggressive lines, It's certainly possible you can kick out size 1s and possibly small size 2 avalanches. But you're also going to be in the kind of terrain where if you kick them out, they could be catastrophic. So don't expect low hazard to mean absolutely safe. From 1996 to 2007, 6 people in Canada died when the avalanche hazard was low from avalanches. In that same period, 6 people died in moderate hazard. So this is where it seems a little weird. During that period, we had the same fatality rate in moderate hazard as we did in low. And I suspect the reason for that is in moderate hazard, we're on our guard again. Because basically what it's 2 means, or moderate, there is conditions on which specific terrain is potentially dangerous. So we're more cautious. So we're less likely to step out into really big features. Size 2 can produce avalanches up to size 3, which are big, but that's rare. They can produce size 2 avalanches, but the way I look at moderate is generally you have a stable snowpack, but there are specific areas where there is the potential to produce an avalanche. That could be fatal. And so as long as you understand where that problem is and you know how to avoid it, then you know what? You're in really good shape. There's a lot of terrain. You can ski safely, and you're in pretty good shape. But if you're unable to identify where that problem is, or your route forces you to go through that region, then this is time to be thinking, okay, I got to step back. Simple enough. Now at the other extreme, literally, we have extreme hazard. In a world where everything is based on odds, I love this definition of extreme hazard. Natural and human-triggered avalanches are certain. Now, certain in my world is not 100%, if you can believe that. Certain in the avalanche industry is 1 in 3. So, if you jump on, in the course of a day, you cross 3 potential avalanche slopes, pretty much guarantee one of them is going to kill you. I can't tell you which one of those 3, but I can guarantee you it's like that. From experience and extreme hazard, I wouldn't say that. I would say that pretty much anytime you step on an avalanche slope, you're more likely than not to trigger an avalanche. These are really big, scary conditions. I equate extreme hazard to basically the, a hurricane that they deal with in the southeastern United States. Extreme hazard means hurricane weather. Get out. Be very conservative. Play it safe because this is big, aggressive. Basically, well, forget that. These are big, severe storms that are just ready. If they haven't slid, they're about to. That's the easiest way to describe extreme terrain. It's the one time I would recommend you do not go into the backcountry. You can go to the ski hill. You can go to the Nordic Center. You can ski in what we call Class 0 terrain. I'll describe that later. But just stay out of any avalanche terrain because if you're going to get the 1 in 200, the 1 in 400 year avalanche, it's probably extreme terrain. I mentioned earlier that Chris Stetham was one of the researchers, or he helped with the coroner's report for the 1987 avalanche where 4 people died in that forest, and they calculated it to be the 1 in 400 year avalanche. The one anomaly that was identified is the avalanche hazard on that day was extreme. So when you're into extreme hazard, that's when you can be thinking, well, you know what, the 1 in 20, the 1 in 50, 1 in 100 year avalanche or bigger, this is when you're likely to see them. So the good news is you're likely to see extreme hazard maybe 1 or 2 days every winter at the most. You can go for an entire winter and we will never use the extreme rating. It is something we save for when we just want to tell the public, all bets are off. This is really bad. Stay home. Unless you're a guide, then you have to go and work in it. But everybody else, behave. High hazard. Very dangerous avalanche conditions. Travel on avalanche terrain is not recommended. I like that one. Again, it's an easy decision. Stay out of avalanche terrain. Does that mean you got to stay home? No. You can travel in areas that have no direct exposure to avalanche terrain. And if you're a good tree skier, you can ski in mature timber with tight trees, so long as there's no open slopes above you and you don't have to cross under any open slopes to get there. Because, on really big powder days, the avalanche hazard might go to high. But if you can stay in good, solid, mature timber that's fairly dense with no history of avalanches, and you'll know that because the trees are over 100 years old and there's nothing steep and big above you, it is some of the best skiing you'll ever find. But you stay out of all avalanche terrain, and if you're not sure, don't push your luck. Because you know what? We calculate the odds here to be around 1 in 30. Which means you can only get away with this for a few days before you're caught in a potentially fatal avalanche. All right, if you're playing the game. So extreme and high, easy, they're bad. Low and moderate, easy, they're good. But there may be an area to be careful about. Don't just turn your brains off. Then we get to this guy called considerable. And considerable is that ugly little gray zone where basically we're saying dangerous avalanche conditions. Careful snowpack evaluation, cautious route finding, and conservative decision making is essential. Natural avalanches are possible. Human-triggered avalanches are likely. Small avalanches in many areas, or large avalanches in specific areas, or very large avalanches in isolated areas. This is that gray zone between things are pretty good and things are bad. And this is where you're going to fry your brain. Because especially in the Rockies, or when you get into a continental snowpack where you have relatively cold conditions and not a lot of snow, the hazard can sit at considerable for days or weeks at a time without changing. Yet you haven't seen a single natural avalanche. And maybe there has been no avalanche activity for a long time. The hazard's just been slowly working its way up to this. So you're like, come on, things have to have changed. It can't be the same. I want to get out. I want to go play. And it sits there. Or you're not seeing a lot of evidence and you want to go skiing. Or they've just brought the hazard down from high. It's been a couple of days since the big storm cycle. They're not seeing any natural activity, but guess what? If you're not seeing a lot of natural activity, we can't keep it at high. We'll drop it to considerable. And while the natural activity is tapered off, the snowpack might still be primed for human-triggered avalanche activity. Or it's slowly built its way up and things have been really good and finally they're saying it's kind of bad. No, it was just a little snow, but it's been adding up. From 1997, I think, to 1996 to 2006, someone did a study on the different danger ratings in North America and Europe. And what they found is more people die in considerable hazard than any other danger rating. And considerable is not the most commonly used danger rating. Moderate is. In Canada, more people died in considerable hazard than all the other danger ratings combined. In, I can't remember if it was France or Switzerland, they too had more deaths in considerable hazard than all the other danger ratings combined. Sorry, my apologies. I'm still getting over the December plague. So these are the danger ratings, and they're very useful. But this in themselves doesn't give you the whole story. And that is why when we look at the Avalanche Bulletin, they'll give you the danger rating and then they'll describe the problems. Because based on the problems, you can decide what areas are safe to travel in, what areas are suspect, and what areas might be just downright dangerous. And then there's this guy. You'll only see this in spring. And what this means is in the spring, when it's cold and the snowpack is frozen, it's nice and strong. Good to go. By afternoon, when it warms up and the snowpack starts to get soft, you've lost a lot of strength in that snowpack, and it has the potential to be a serious avalanche threat. And so the way you manage this come springtime is you leave early, or anytime you're seeing this kind of a pattern, because it's not just spring anymore, folks. And what you can do, what I've done in the past, is you get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're skiing at 3. And if you're going to ski to the summit of a peak, you get to the summit of the peak by, 10, 11. So the snowpack is warming up, but it's not getting the full intensity of the sun yet. At 11 o'clock, you peel off your skins, you ski down to the car, and by 11:30, 12 o'clock, you're off the whole mountain. Because by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on how it's heating up, that whole area might be an avalanche feature. But so long as it's cold and it's solid, you're in pretty good shape. And that's what they're telling you with this. This is the additional one. And then I think we have a SPA. Nope. SPA. Special Public Avalanche Warning. These are really useful. So what a SPA is when we forecast the hazard to the public, it has to fit a box. It has to be low, moderate, considerable, high, or extreme. Except the world doesn't work in boxes. Okay? And we don't think in 257 flavors of avalanche hazard. So we have to break it down to 5. Now imagine the avalanche hazard is considerable, but it's really on the high end of considerable. We couldn't call it high because we have a checklist, sort of a protocol we have to work through to define what the hazard is. And so you check all the boxes and you say, okay, according to the hazard, it's considerable, or 3. And you're kind of like, yeah, but you know what? We're right on the edge of a major avalanche cycle. Or there's a big storm cycle coming in and it's going to tip the scales. What do we do? We have to call it considerable. But you know what? It's not like we're used to, and this is what we do. And we sweat bullets over this. I was leading an operation at one lodge, and at the end of the day, we all came in and we said, okay, based on our observations, what are we calling it? And in the end, we all agreed a hazard was considerable. And then I looked at everyone and said, well, are we going to treat it like it's considerable? And everyone was just quiet and looking at their feet because we were scared. It fit the box, but things were so touchy that we could not believe we weren't seeing widespread natural activity. And so basically I just told my group, listen, we all agree it's considerable, but what do you say in the field? We just treat it like it's high. We have to record it as a considerable hazard. That's our training. But every one of us agrees it's a lot scarier out there than it appears. And we did. And that's what a SPA is. Whenever we get a situation where it fits this box, but it's not what you'd expect if you were just coming out for the day, then we have to say, whoa, we're going to release a SPA. And what that is telling the public, this is not normal. Be scared. So if you ever see a SPA pop out, read the SPA, find out what the problem is. And if you really know the snowpack and you understand what they're talking about, you can play with this. You can say, okay, they're really worried about the buried surface ore on north aspects above tree line in the alpine. Okay, I get that. I've been skiing around. I agree with them. I think I can still work the other slopes and give myself a healthy amount of margin, but I have to be very attentive to that. This is not the realm of general recreationalists. And to be perfectly honest, it's often not my realm either as a guide, because I don't work in one area every day. I move around. And so if I've been working in the Rockies and then I'm out teaching a course in Rogers Pass or guiding group and they release a SPA, I don't have the familiarity with that snowpack to say, okay, so, this is what they're seeing. Okay, so, Sylvia and Lisa are saying that this is what's going on in the snowpack and this is what I need to be worried about. But, this is my 3rd day in Rogers Pass all winter. Jeez. And so the way I manage this is I look at the hazard rating and I just bump it up one. So if they're calling it considerable hazard or a 3 with a SPA, I'll read their recommendations and I'll just say, okay, I know it's 3, but I'm going to treat it like it's a 4, like it's high. And now I'm going to pick really conservative terrain until I've had enough time to learn this snowpack. And that will take me a few days to be comfortable stepping out. So SPAs are really important because they're the only functional tool we have to warn the public that, yeah, we're calling it this, but actually it's worse. Or, you know what? It can surprise you. Because years ago, K-Country put a SPA out in moderate hazard. It's the only time I've ever seen them do that. And they did that because they had a slope release completely unexpected and it killed somebody. And it was not anything they had predicted. It was not anything any of us had predicted. And we just had to recognize that something was going on that was beyond our field of knowledge. And while most of the area was behaving the way we thought it should, there was something going on sideways. And so they released a SPA and they said, listen, be aware, stay away from really big, large open slopes over a certain slope angle because they're not behaving the way we think they should. So they're good tools. Watch the SPA. Okay. Oh yeah. How you guys doing? I know, I'm sitting in a room talking to myself. My spouse often wonders if I need help. So how do you like that slope? If you're going to ski that slope, do you want to be sure of the bulletin? I do. It's called Video Peak. And the slope angle is consistently over 30 degrees from top to bottom. It's avalanche terrain. And it's a wickedly beautiful slope. But you're going to have to ski right up the face of that thing to line yourself up to ski down. So it's a huge amount of time standing on an avalanche slope. Haven't skied it yet, actually, but I will. And I'll wait till it's stable. So this is where confidence comes in. You'll see it on the bulletin. If they have low confidence, either there's a lot of variability in the snowpack or they don't have a lot of information. Moderate confidence, you know what? We're gaining information or we're gaining consistent results, but it's not perfect. High confidence is not a guarantee, but it's pretty solid and it's consistent. So ideally you want high confidence in those bulletins. But understand, there are times when the best we can do is moderate or low. And that has to be taken into consideration. Okay, so when we talk about problems, we talk about persistent weak layers, deep persistent weak layers, wind slab and storm snow. Those are the big ones. Okay, so a persistent weak layer is generally somewhere in the middle of the snowpack to within 20 centimeters of the top. All right, and those are going to be around for a long time. Deep persistent slabs, those are generally near or at the very bottom of your snowpack. So they're much harder to trigger, but if you can, the entire winter snowpack is coming down with you. Wind slab is a short-term problem caused by wind moving loose snow, and basically, this sounds kind of backwards, but it's actually helping to pack it on the sheltered side because it's broken up the crystals and allowed them to settle and bond much faster. On the windward slopes, things are actually getting safer, but the skiing's lousy, or the riding. And then storm snow is basically the snow that falls during a storm. And you are definitely going to get into an argument with anyone else who's taken an avalanche course between wind slab and storm snow or storm slab. Don't sweat it. They're both short-term problems. They're both bad. So it doesn't matter what you call it. It's a problem. If you want to be really anal, you look up the OGRs, the observational guidelines and rules for snow science, and OGRS. You'll find them on the Canadian Avalanche Association website. We've just updated them. During the storm, it's a storm slab. Once the snow stops falling, if it keeps blowing, it's a wind slab. Okay? That is our new official definition. And you might actually impress the instructor if you tell them that. But like I said, it's just semantics. It's bad. End of story. and it's relatively short-lived. Okay. So how do we manage all this? We get all this information and we're kind of like, uh-oh, geez, it's a 3-3-2, considerable, moderate. We always start from the alpine and work our way down. So alpine, tree line, below tree line, 3-3-2, or 3-2-1. That's sort of how we say it. And does that mean I got to stay home? No, because half the winter in the Rockies, we have a 3, somewhere in that scale, a considerable hazard. But we choose our terrain appropriately. And this is something that was developed by Parks Canada, and they really did a nice job. So I'll let the fella who developed it describe it to you, and then I'll tell you about the changes that are coming down the pipe.
The Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale, or the ATES scale, was developed by Parks Canada. Initially, we developed the system so we could provide park visitors with a relative scale that would give them a sense of how serious the terrain is that they're going to travel through. So the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale system is similar in many ways to existing rating systems for rivers or for rock climbing, where people can get a sense ahead of time if they're up to the challenge or not. And if they're not, then they can look at a list of trips and choose trips that might be appropriate for either the conditions or for their level of training. There's 3 rating levels in the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale. Class 1 is simple terrain, Class 2 is challenging terrain, and Class 3 is complex terrain. So one thing that's unique about the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale is that it's based on landscape. So unlike an avalanche bulletin, which changes every day with the snow, we get new snow, the danger goes up. We have a long period of clear weather, the avalanche danger goes down, and it can fluctuate all the time. The terrain doesn't change, it's static. So the rating system that we use, class 1, 2, and 3, you can expect it to be the same. Simple terrain is generally pretty straightforward, generally not the kind of place where you're going to find very many big steep slopes. These are places like trails through the forest, fire roads, low-angled areas in alpine meadows, places where generally there's almost no avalanche terrain, but there might be a little bit. You might have a cut bank above a river, perhaps, or perhaps you're just going to cross the very bottom edge of a large avalanche path where an avalanche might only reach that area once in 30 years. So the chance of being caught in an avalanche in simple terrain is very low. And that's the kind of place where we encourage people who are just learning to go and get their feet underneath them and learn a little bit about the mountains and not worry too much about getting caught in avalanches. Class 2 terrain is challenging terrain. And this is the kind of place where there is lots of large slopes around, perhaps, that you can trigger an avalanche on. But the key piece is that you can get around them if you know how. So this is a place where to travel safely, you need to be able to recognize avalanche terrain. You can't travel blindly and assume you'll miss all the avalanche terrain because there's sometimes lots of avalanche slopes around. But the key here is that you have the opportunity to avoid them. So you can choose to ski a steep slope if you want, and there's often really good skiing to be found in Class 2 terrain. But if you got out there and you decided you didn't like it or the conditions were not what you thought, then there's ways you can get around that terrain and safely make it back home at the end of the day. And so it's a place with options. Class 3 terrain is complex terrain, and that's a place, just as the word says, where it's complex. And the terrain is big and steep, and you're going to be exposed to avalanche terrain pretty significantly throughout the day. Lots of people travel in complex terrain. It's commonly traveled. A lot of the big ski trips in the mountains are just by their nature in complex terrain. Skiing happens best at, the same kind of slope angles as avalanches. So complex terrain, avalanches, and good skiing all go really well together. One thing you'll find about complex terrain is there's not usually very many options in there. So it's the kind of place, if you're going to go there, you need to be prepared to make decisions about crossing avalanche terrain. And your choices are often either to go in it or not. You don't always have a logical way to get around the slope, or perhaps you're going to travel up a very steep valley with multiple avalanche paths that overlap the trail. And so you need to be prepared to travel through those. You can't assume that you'll get around them. If you're going into complex avalanche terrain, then expect to be exposed to big avalanche paths.
Okay, so yeah, that gave me a minute for my throat to recover. I always appreciate it when Grant does the talking for me. Okay, so the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale is a pretty impressive development. It's looking at the landscape and allows us to choose safe trips relative to the hazard. It's about to change. At the recreational level, there is no significant changes, nothing relevant to what you're doing, but they're going to add 0. 0 means no avalanche hazard. You do not need to bring a probe, shovel, or transceiver. So if you're looking for a place where you can go out with your family or your friends and not have to think about avalanche terrain, you look for stuff that's class 0. If you're getting into really big avalanche terrain, complex doesn't necessarily cover it all. So going up to the bow hut is complex avalanche terrain because you're confined to a gully which has a few moments of significant avalanche exposure, and you have to basically ski up an avalanche slope to get to the hut. But 3/4 of the trip is not in avalanche terrain. So that makes complex, that meets the qualifications for complex. There's no way around it, you got to go through the start zone. However, you compare that to, say, going up the Granddaddy Couloir on Bow Peak. Essentially, once you start hiking up slope, you're on a scree slope that's 34 degrees. You're in avalanche terrain. And as you hike up that scree slope right to the top, you're right through the start zone. You could trigger an avalanche anywhere there. Then you get to the couloir, the slope angle starts kicking up into the 40s, and you have to basically kick tracks right in the couloir with potentially overhanging cornices that could also trigger a slide or fail naturally. And you're in the line of fire all the way to the very top of where you're going to ski. Then you have to dig a ledge out on the start zone, put your skis down, clamp into them, and then ski down the avalanche slope you just spent the last hour and a half climbing up. That seemed like a level above complex. So they've added extreme. So 1 through 3 remain the same. 0 has no avalanche exposure, and 4 is extreme. You're going to be exposed to avalanche hazard for very long periods of time with little or no options available to you to reduce or mitigate the consequences. That's how the system is changing. Now, in K country, let me see if this link works. It did. Ha! Okay. They have built a new avalanche terrain exposure scale system. And it is built online so that you can zoom back, move around, and you can see the landscape. And if you want to go somewhere like, oh, I don't know, let's see what we got here. You want to go to, here we are, Mount Inflexible, this is better, Mount Kidd, Olympic Summit, oh, here we are. Mount Nestor, nope. Mount Shark, Mount Smuts, okay. So this is called the Fist, and right along in here are some popular ski lines. If you want to ski this big black feature, that's super slope, and it is rated complex terrain because you can sneak out in a few places. But for the most part, you've got significant avalanche hazard. And if you want to ski the face of Mount Snuts, that's extreme because for much of the route it's very steep. You need a good year with enough snow, and there is no escape. Plus, if you get caught even just tumbling down this, we'll finish you off. So it's a great way of figuring out your reference. Down here, this is Tent Ridge. Tent Ridge used to be fairly popular for ski touring, but it's actually quite a difficult area to be able to move safely in. And you can see the vast majority of it is complex terrain. And there are pockets of simple terrain, and down below there are areas that are challenging. So based on Grant's system, you can look at this and you can see, based on where you want to go, let's see. You can see what you want to do. Down in here, this is, Tent Ridge below the fist. I can't remember the name of it now. It'll come to me in a few minutes. But they've got the terrain done beautifully on a 3D map. They're the first people to do this. And they have got, basically, if there's no coloring within their search area, oh, they don't have 0. They only have added extreme. They haven't added the class 0 yet. So they're utilizing this. And it's a very useful resource. For the national parks, oh, that's interesting. Parks has changed their system. They have. They've changed them both. Okay, Parks has just updated their Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale. But they have a PDF that you can download, or they did up until recently. And it has a list of trails on it that are Class 1, simple, Class 2, challenging, Class 3, complex. And so based on the avalanche hazard, you can determine where is a good place to go and play. And here's the scale right here. So for simple, challenging, complex terrain, here's part of Glacier National Park. So if the avalanche hazard is 433, high in the alpine, considerable at tree line, and considerable below tree line, then you look at your highest rating, it says extra caution. So you need to be careful. But the Beaver River Trail, the Rogers Pass Ski Hill, which, unless you know the area, you'll never find, or the approach to the Wheeler Hut, they all involve extra caution, but they may be reasonable things to do. And when we say extra caution, what they mean is it's not that it's not recommended, but if you know, say, going up to the Wheeler Hut, you're familiar with the area and you're going to stay on the trail, there are no significant hazards. But if you were to wander off and even 300 meters from the hut, there are locations that are exposed to slide paths. Challenging terrain. So pull out your guidebook and you look this up. Well, Grizzly Shoulder, Avalanche Crest, Cheops Glades, and Flat Creek all offer an opportunity to go and ski in hazard when it is challenging. Moderate. Okay, it's moderate. You're in normal caution, so you're fine. Considerable, extra caution. And the reason it's considerable, or reason it's extra caution, is because these areas do have exposure to avalanche terrain. So long as you know how to identify it, and they're the large, big open slopes that you stay out of, then you're fine. So long as you understand that. On Grizzly Shoulder, there's a couple of, they're not really couloirs, but there are these slots through the trees that run for long distances where you can ski and basically be out of the trees with about 10 meters of open slope on each side. That's the place you want to avoid. If you understand that, then sure, going in considerable hazard, or 3, is reasonable in challenging terrain. And then complex terrain, basically, these are slopes, like the Bonnie Glacier is exposed to multiple avalanche paths, and you probably have to step on an avalanche slope to get there. Okay, so it's never rated as green, but in low and moderate hazard, it may be acceptable, depending on what the specific problem is and your ability to identify those problems. Okay, so this is a really good system. It works well. And when you look at avalanche fatalities with people using this system, it's very low. It's proven itself to be an effective tool to help us define which trails are the ones to use based on the hazard. And it's not just trails. I'm kind of sad to see that Parks Canada has changed their links, because I'd like to show you. They've done this for ice climbs, and they've got these really well done, laid out ice climbing routes inside the national parks, and a tremendous amount of information to help you decide whether or not this is appropriate for the hazard. Okay, so let's look at this. The hazard is 333. Okay, puts us right here. Would we go into simple terrain? Okay, so this is my son when he was 7 years old. Would I take him in simple terrain when conditions are like this? Well, let's see. Oh, there we go. So yeah, I would, because it's actually pretty benign terrain. There's a few features I have to avoid, but most of the landscape is very reasonable, and there can even be some good downhill skiing in simple terrain. Okay, whoops. Previous page. There we go. Okay, so in challenging terrain, McGill Shoulder. This is blue. This is challenging terrain, and this is the hazard. It says extra caution. Do we go or not? This is actually one of the places I go when things are a little touchy, because I've actually got a lot of good tree skiing in here and off to the right that you can't see. So as long as I avoid these big open sections, there's still a lot of good terrain I can utilize and have a healthy safety margin. And again, this image isn't the best. The really good skiing with lots of trees and few avalanche slopes is just off to the right. So this is challenging terrain, and I have used it in considerable hazard. All right. So, would we go into complex terrain like Crowfoot Mountain? Crowfoot Mountain basically involves having to work your way up through a terrain trap, which really confines you with steep slopes. You have to cross little start zones. If they fail, you're going to get washed down into a small cliff and into a canyon. There's some steep convex rolls. They're not big, but they're unavoidable, and they can produce size 2 avalanches. This is complex terrain, not recommended when the hazard is 333 or considerable. All right, it works pretty well. Okay, now, weather. They always tell us to check the weather when we go out, partly because then we know what we're up against, but also this is how we forecast avalanches. Avalanches are a 100% avalanches are a 100% weather-based phenomenon. All right. So when we're looking at trying to forecast where the avalanche hazard is going to be in a couple of days, we look at the weather, because the weather will tell us. It's not simple, but it is that obvious. And when you dig in the snow and we look at the layers in the snow, I don't know if you took an avalanche course in the past, and some instructors still do this. They'll actually dig profiles and tell the students to look at the layers and analyze them. And you know what? That's not going to help you. If you plan on doing this for a living, by all means, learn about the layers and how to identify them and figure them out. But the layers in the snow basically are records of what the weather has been over the course of the winter. The winter weather is written in the snowpack. It's just like geologists look at layers in the rock to discover the history of the earth. Avalanche forecasters look at the layers of the snow and we're able to read the weather patterns of the winter. Some weather patterns produce stable conditions, some produce unstable. We usually get a combination of both. So what we do is we look at the weather. Okay? And this is my favorite free weather tool. I do have access to a more expensive weather system, but that's because the company I work for makes it available to me. For the public, this is a really nice weather system. So let's find out the weather forecast for Lake Louise. Or you know what? Better yet, Bow Summit. There is no weather forecast. Or Saskatchewan River Crossing. This is the north end of Banff. There is no weather forecast here, and I don't think we have much for weather stations. So how do we get any kind of a forecast for all these areas we like to go to, but they're not forecast for us? This spot weather is really nice. You click on the spot, and using all the existing data from Environment Canada, it then builds through an algorithm a basic model of what we can expect. And there's a whole range of forecasts in here. Okay? Here's my advice. And this is not my opinion. This was given to me by basically a working meteorologist. Ignore the Americans. Their weather models are simply not as accurate as the Canadians. And the most accurate Canadian model is the 1 kilometer west. Okay? The second most accurate is this one, the 2.5 kilometer. But for all of Canada, the 1 kilometer is available. So click on that, and it'll give you a forecast. So it was calculated at 5 a.m. this morning, Mountain Standard Time. And so from there, you can see the forecast for now and into the next day. The red is your temperatures. The green is the dew point, at which point does the moisture come out of the air. And the relative humidity is the blue line. So this model will tell you the temperatures and the humidity. Scroll down. The skies and clouds, okay, there is no precipitation forecast because precipitation would be in this area. Sorry about the rolling. Down below you see this running line. This is your cloud cover. So you can see, and it's not exact. Don't think, well, if I show up exactly at 11 a.m., there will be no clouds, and then at 7 p.m., the cloud cover will be 65%. No. It's clearing overnight and into the morning and building in the afternoon. That's how you want to read this. Don't sit here and think clear, 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 and then boom! In the span of 25 minutes at 1 a.m., it'll be completely obscured. Well, 71%. No. But it gives you a pretty good idea of your expected cloud cover. And then you can look at your winds. And the winds, the arrows are always the direction of the wind. And these are westerlies predominantly, then southwesterlies, because the wind we describe from where it comes, not where it's blowing to. So westerlies start from the left and they blow to the right. As they start in the bottom left and the top right, well, that's a southwest. Those give you your winds. Severe weather indices, a little more advanced than what we're talking about. Cape and helicity, also more advanced than what we're going to talk about. Low-level winds, if you're going to be getting up on ridge tops or gaining elevation, you can start to see that as you get above the ground, the winds are going to pick up significantly. But nothing, well, significantly. I mean, it's going from 10 kilometers pretty much just above the ground to 25 kilometers, 20 meters in the air and up there. So if you're up on a ridge, that could be significant. The rest of the material, planetary boundary, surface radiation flux, they're useful, but again, they're just beyond the scope of this course and what you need to know what you're getting into. Okay, so spot weather. Windy does something very similar. It's much more colorful, but I find that unless you buy the paid subscription, the information isn't as accurate. You can also go to remote weather stations. So let's go back to the Avalanche bulletin. Okay. And scroll in. And scroll in. See that symbol? Those are weather stations. When they finally break down to 2 weather stations, you can click on that station. And this is on Mount Simpson. And let's see. Okay. I'm not sure how I get into this and out of their information. This is probably a function because I'm working in Lightbox, a window within a window for the internet. But anyways, you can go to Simpson, the Upper Simpson. Oh, okay, there we go. And so you can see that there has been no new snow. It's also not recording the HS, the height of the snow. So it may be down, but it is recording temperatures. And so an hour ago, or yeah, you get information within an hour. It was minus 7.6. The wind speed is 12 kilometers an hour. And you can go back, I think, several days. Might be a week. And so we have this data and we can see what the weather's been doing. And it's been very mild, considering how high up on the mountain it is. Temperatures of around minus 7 to minus 4, with winds in the low, just breaking into the moderate range. So the winds are not moving that much snow. So there's probably very little wind slab forming. There's been no new snow, so there's no wind slab, no storm slab. And the temperatures, basically the snowpack's not melting and getting weaker. Okay, but it's also not refreezing to get even stronger. So we can get pretty good information just off these remote stations. As I said, it's not quite real time, but you can find out up to an hour ago, and you can look back several days. If you want to get totally whacked out, you can go to something called ARFI. Just write that acronym down. And now we can look at weather stations, weather cameras, remote systems all over Western Canada. So this is a wonderful resource. Just be careful you don't spend more time analyzing the weather than you do traveling on your trip. But it can give you a lot of good information. I was having to drive home from Whistler to Canmore, and I was using the weather cameras on certain sections of the Duffy to see whether or not it was viable to be driving back that way. And between that and the weather stations, things looked really good, and the drive was fine. So this is information for short-term weather forecasting. And yes, Environment Canada does a great job, but they don't forecast all the little places we go to. And the Weather Network actually does forecast for more little itty-bitty places, but they're using Environment Canada's data, and they're still not necessarily going to Saskatchewan River Crossing or Bow Summit or the top of Rogers Pass or the Bonnie Glacier or a section on the one of the local peaks around Whistler. So this is where it's really nice to use some of these algorithms. Because remember, avalanches are weather-based phenomena. That's absolutely critical to understand. Okay, another thing you can use is called the MIN, the Mountain Information Network. And guess where that is? Yes, it's on Avalanche Canada's site. And so, again, this is a way of sort of doing one-stop shopping. Just going to pull back here, see if I can find something. There we go. There's a couple of pins. Where'd they go to? There we are. Sorry, I'll have this figured out, but Avalanche Canada is using a slightly new system from what I'm used to. So, good for them. So these guys were right here, just above tree line. They're on the Stanley Headwall. They're ice climbers. Now, how did I do that last time? Oh, yeah. Okay. So, you get the name of the person who they submitted it to, their location, and so the day was cloudy, foggy, and windy. And that's all they put in. But you can get information from these pins in that, let's see. There's it's the same one. Okay, you only get the one pin per site. But people will post this and they'll say, you know, we skied South Aspects. Ski quality was good, great, excellent. Did they observe recent avalanche activity? They'll write down if they saw anything. If they had an event, they change the color of the pin so that you know that there was an avalanche. Either it was remote or they triggered it, but there was no serious injuries. And then they'll have another pin that's basically red and black, which means a fatality. And you can click on that and gather information. So it's a way of getting site-specific information about the avalanche conditions, but also about the quality of the area. So if the skiing's really bad and you've got some pins in there and they're recent, you can find out what's going on. The pins only last about a week and then they fade. The difference is if there is a fatality, that pin will stay for the entire winter. So you can trust that when you see a pin, the information can be no more than a week old. Yeah. Yeah, this is just that single pin. So the MIN is really good. Then you can also go to the Mountain Conditions Report, which is accessed on the ACMG, or Association of Canadian Mountain Guides, on their website. And this only guides can contribute to it with the idea that basically you're getting information from professionals, which is nice. However, there's not nearly as much of it. I find the public is generally pretty good. Sometimes people are posting a MIN because they're bragging about what they did, but you usually see that pretty quickly. So it tends to be a fairly reliable resource. Okay. So we have the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale to help you figure out where to go based on the avalanche hazard. But once you start getting into that extra caution zone, it's like, well, do we or don't we? It didn't really quite say if we should go or not. And then what if you get into a specific feature and you're trying to figure out, can I go onto this shoulder or this big open slope? Is it safe to ski? We can't cover that kind of information in the bulletin. And for that, you need to make site-specific information. And the way you get that is largely by looking at the features and field observations. So there's a tool called the evaluator, and it was produced by Pascal Hagley, who is a researcher at Simon Fraser University, and he focuses on avalanches. And unlike Bruce, who is an engineer, Pascal does a lot of work with statistics and human behavior, which is an area that has huge potential to help improve and change the way we move in the mountains. This is the evaluator, and it has a series of questions. Now, I'll be honest with you, I have a love-hate relationship with this tool, and I'll show you why in a minute, but I'll talk about the things I really like about it, because I do recommend you use it, and it is a very valuable tool when used within its limitations. So let's say we've basically come up to the edge of a big open slope, and we're like, oh. I look at my friends and I say, well, would you ski that? And they all kind of look at me and say, oh yeah, I'd ski that. I'd ski that. Oh yeah, I'd ski that. It's the wrong question. Is it safe to ski that? We all want to ski good lines. Is it safe to ski? Oh, I'm not sure. Well, you should know, you're the guide. And I'm like, well, no, I'm on my days off and I really don't know much more than you guys do. So let's go through the checklist. Okay, that's what this is. First of all, what did the bulletin say? Ever since the bulletin came out, there have been 2 days in my entire life that I can remember not having checked the bulletin. And I was embarrassed both times. This is standard practice for me. Every day I go through, I check the bulletin or a similar type of document that's available to me as a professional. What's the rating? If the danger rating is considerable, 3 or higher, you get a point. Then, do you have a persistent weak layer? That's a persistent avalanche problem. If the answer is yes, persistent weak layer or a deep persistent weak layer, you get a point. All right, I like this. Simple. Slab avalanches. Are there signs of slab avalanches in the area from today or yesterday? Okay, technically it's 48 hours. But if you're seeing recent avalanche activity in the last 2 days, you get a point. Now, if you don't know if it's in the last 2 days, when was the last storm cycle? Because chances are it occurred during the storm cycle, especially if you're seeing multiples. And if the last storm cycle just finished 2 days ago, okay, great. Now you've got a reference. If you're seeing, significant amount of avalanche activity and you don't know when the last storm was, or it's been quite a few days ago, it gets harder to figure this out. But this is actually a really important clue. If you can figure out, sort of estimate the age of the recent avalanche activity, that's good information. All right. Signs of instability. Are there signs of snowpack instability? And I will show you these. It includes whoops, shooting or radiating cracks, and you're on kind of stiff snow, and when you bang on it with your foot, it goes kind of like an empty barrel. You can just hear that echo underneath your foot. Once I actually felt the snowpack shaking as I did that. Really bad. Those aren't good signs, so you get a point. Critical warming. Has there been a recent rapid rise in temperature to near zero, or is the upper snowpack wet due to strong sun? Is there an above air freezing temperature or rain? If it's raining, it's just bad. Okay, if the temperatures are rising rapidly, that's a concern. If they're up above zero, it's a significant concern. If the surface of the snowpack is wet due to sun, that's a concern. If it's been raining, that's just bad. Okay, but as a group, it's 1. Okay. So you can see how my mind sort of expands on these a bit, and it's just because I've been doing this for 40 years. Slope steepness. Is the slope between 30 and 35 degrees? So is it a slope that you'd like to ski? You get a point. Or is the slope steeper than 35 degrees? If this is powder, what they're saying is this a slope you'd really like to ski? Or if you're a climber and you've got to kick steps up these slopes, how steep are they? If you're a sledder, same thing. What's your slope angle? And the only way to accurately get a slope measurement or a slope angle is to measure it. I don't have it with me right now, but I'll bring my slope tool up tomorrow, and you can actually see it's a little slope meter. It's a ball bearing in a case, and as I move it up and down, just like a level, the ball bearing moves and tells me the slope angle. You can get apps for your smartphones that are very accurate. Those work great. Just make sure you've got a good charge for your phone. And there are mapping tools. The one I bring up all the time is CalTopo, only because I have a professional subscription to it and I need to know how that product works. If you're getting this off Gaia or Fat Maps or whatever, good. But I can tell you that CalTopo has got really good maps with slope angles on them. And so you can see before you even leave home what kind of slope angles you're going to be getting into on a big scale, not on a micro scale. If you're standing on top of a little slope, it's not going to show up. But if you're looking to get a sense of how big these slopes are, so you're going to go ski to the summit of Mount Field, it's a good indicator of what you're up against. All right. And as I said, any of the apps that do it, fantastic. My bias, it's not a preference, it is a total bias, is CalTopo, but that's because it's an industry standard. So you take that information, and those are your field observations. And you add up the numbers. Oh, I didn't go through the other side. Sorry. So, I didn't finish it either. Terrain traps. Okay, this is the rest of the card. My apologies. I've been sitting in a room by myself for too long. Terrain traps. Are there gullies, trees, or cliffs that increase the consequences of being caught in an avalanche? Okay, if you get caught in an avalanche, is there anything below you that's going to make a bad situation worse? If the answer is yes, you get a point. Slope shape. Is the slope convex or unsupported? Remember back when? If the answer is yes, you get another point. Forest density. Okay. Is the slope in the alpine, or are the trees spaced far enough apart that you're not worried about hitting one? A burn, or wide spaced glades? If the answer is yes, you get another point. Okay. Whoops. So now you go to the back of the evaluator and you add up all the purple points and all the blue points and you see where you land on this scale. And if you're in the green, then normal caution is advised, proceed. If you're in the red, travel is not recommended. You should not go into this feature. And if it's yellow, you should apply extra caution. This is where the card is, in my opinion, a bit of a failure, because it's not giving you an answer. This is exactly where you're going to be struggling, is in the extra caution. Because in the real world, you've probably already decided not to go there if you're in the red, based on those questions. And you probably didn't even pull the card out if you're in the green, because the hazard is low, low, and low, with very little concerns. Now, where do you say yes and where do you say no? The logical expectation is the closer you get to the red, the more likely you are to say no. It's not true. I have been right in here and I was totally comfortable. I would do it again. I took my group. It was a slope that I actually expect would slide and did, but it was a small enough feature that I could manage it safely, and the landing was perfectly soft. So even if I was wrong, the worst that could happen is my guests were going to have to help me dig my skis out and look for them. Okay. But no one was going to get killed or hurt. And I have pulled the plug here. Not because things were particularly dangerous, but because, this was a winter where there were problems. And we were in a period when things had really settled down and been quiet, but we had some long-term, persistent, weak layers, and they were catching people off guard. We just hadn't had one pop up recently. When I went through the evaluator, it put me here. But you know what? I said no. And I said no because even though the slope was a little under 30 degrees, it was 400 or 500 vertical meters, top to bottom, and it was 200 or 300 meters left to right. And I knew if something went wrong, I was going to kill everybody in my group, and there was no escape. And I was just looking at that thinking, you know what? It's probably not going to happen. But if it does happen, it's going to be on a winter like this, on a slope like this. So I came up with a lie and told my guests the skiing would be crappy, and we wandered off and we skied down the ridge, which was very safe and really unpleasant skiing. So this is the problem, and this is the big crux of moving through avalanche terrain. My spouse and I, we get along very nicely, but one of the few arguments we had was about our son. Because when he was little, my spouse was, oh yeah, he can go skiing. And he got on the biathlon team and had a wonderful time. He's really good. He's an amazing skier. But she didn't want to rock climbing. That was way too dangerous. He can't go rock climbing, but he could go ski touring. And I was kind of like, well, let me get this straight. I can point him out to some really nice, clean routes that are incredibly difficult, but have got good bolts or take gear really well. The worst that can happen to him is he breaks his ankle or he breaks his arm. That's his worst case scenario if he plays the game safely. As soon as he goes ski touring and he's not with me, or he's not with, he's not right on the trails he's supposed to go within the terrain of the 8 scale, he's going to have to start making decisions for himself. And these are really, really tough decisions. Usually, maybe, almost always, generally speaking, or rarely. But, the yes-no answers we want, you can't find when you're traveling in avalanche terrain many times. There's times when I feel very comfortable because the odds of things going wrong are so small, I'm safer than driving my car. And there's times when things are so bad that it's easy. It's just like, we're going to stay away from everything. And those I can manage very nicely. But it's that considerable 3 that just lives in the Rockies for extended periods of time. I struggle with them. I've been skiing in that kind of terrain since I was 16. And I struggle with it today. And I qualify as a senior citizen now. This is tough. And so this is where the tool fails. But let me help you with it, because I don't like leaving it on that note. There are ways to help you figure this out. And they are advanced skills. Where are regional snowpacks? Now casting. Okay. One of the things I really admired about a book nobody reads, it's called Avalanche Accidents in Canada. It's all about our fatalities. Is they've looked at the evaluator, and they've also looked at the conditions under which people perished in avalanches. And it's really valuable because it's taken the evaluator and it's given it real meaning. You heard me expanding on some of the questions, and that's because there's certain elements that are more significant or less significant in my mind. And I've tried to base that on my experience, but also on this data, because that book contains data that is vastly superior and far more extensive than my experience. And one of the big things is 92% of all avalanches were human triggered. So the odds of just standing there and having the mountain land on top of your head as bad luck is possible, but it's very rare. It's rare. Okay. So someone's got to get in the start zone. Good to know. 82%, 4 to 5 all fatalities occurred when the avalanche hazard was in the considerable, high, or extreme regional hazard rating. Okay, so as soon as you hit 3 or considerable hazard and above, you need to be thinking that natural avalanches are possible and human triggered avalanches are fairly easy. So don't push your luck. Don't go ski in bigger, bolder lines when the hazard is elevated. Simple as that. 4 out of 5 fatalities. Okay. 76% of fatalities occurred in complex terrain. 3/4 of all people died in complex or extreme terrain. If I have any doubts, I just step back to challenging because I have so many more options to work with. I like that. Okay. 73% of all avalanche fatalities occurred on open slopes. Again, that's almost 3 out of every 4 avalanches occurred on big open slopes. That doesn't mean that glades are safe, but they're safer. And dense trees are really safe. Not 100%, but they're in the high 90s. Okay, so long as there's nothing big open above those trees. 69%, so 7 out of 10 of all avalanche fatalities occurred within 48 hours of observed avalanche activity. If you're seeing natural slab avalanches, okay, what you need to be thinking is they went naturally. So, do you have a weak layer? Absolutely. Did you reach critical load for avalanches? Absolutely. Now that they seem to have stopped, does that mean it's safe? No. They might very well be strong enough to basically end natural avalanches, but still well within the range of human triggering. Give yourself a few days for things to settle out. Different snowpacks have different timings. I just came back from the coast, and I was amazed at how quickly the snowpack would heal in the snowpack around Whistler. It's warm, it's wet, settles, it bonds, got a problem. Just wait a couple of days and boom, go ski it. Most of the time, not always. I understand there was just a group buried, and I'll bet you I was tracking that weak layer on December 16th when I left. We had a crust and we had some concerns, and you know what? We were all thinking it's probably going to pack out, but you know what? This is the one to watch. And again, that's the forecaster's job. They'll tell you if you need to be watching for something. But, you know, the writing was there, and if they hadn't had much storm activity until recently, then yeah, I think that could have been the problem. Might have been something new. I don't know. But give yourself at least a couple of days for things to settle down. It doesn't mean you can't go skiing. Just don't ski the start zones and the tracks of the avalanche slopes. Certainly not when it's considerable or higher. Okay, so these were less prominent but still very valid warnings to consider when you're moving through the landscape. I'll show you a video of this, but when you get whomphs or radiating cracks, 30% of all avalanche fatalities saw those warning signs before they got on the slope that produced a fatality. Okay, these are warning signs. What it is basically you've got a hard layer on a weak layer and it's being triggered by your weight. We call these avalanches if you're on 30 to 45 degree terrain. If you're not, they just go whoomph, or you get these cracks that radiate out. But what that tells you is if this terrain was steeper, we'd have an avalanche. Or if the trees were more open, we'd have an avalanche. Because I've also had this in the trees on 30, 35 degree slopes. And I'll get these whoops and the whole snowpack just moves a half an inch. And then it stops and I'm kind of like, okay, take a deep breath. You're in good dense timber. Just don't leave it. 1/4 of all avalanche fatalities occurred on sparsely treed or open glades. Remember, easy tree skiing is not a guarantee of stability. Almost 25%, a quarter of all avalanche fatalities, occurred during critical warming. When the temperature rises, the hazard is probably increasing. When the snowpack surface is getting moist, the hazard is definitely increasing. If you've got weak layers deeper in the snowpack, they're going to be easier to trigger. Approximately, Thomas Exner, a friend I used to guide with, did his PhD looking at the effects of solar warming. And the number he gave me is he figured about 1 in 5 avalanche fatalities could be directly or attributed to the snowpack warming. So that's pretty significant. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it's a warning sign. And remember, challenging terrain back on the 8 scale has avalanche terrain in it. And almost 1 in 5 fatalities occurred in avalanches in challenging terrain. So, if it's spooky, step back to simple or the safer terrain within the challenging. Don't think that just because you stepped into class 2, every place is safe. So that I find is actually some pretty useful information to expand on the evaluator. Sorry. And so using the evaluator and those cues, using the checklist off the evaluator, and then applying to basically the statistical analysis of fatalities, that starts to help you make good decisions when you step out of the rigid definitions of the 8 scale. Because if you go to Crowfoot Glades, it's challenging terrain. There's some big avalanche slopes there. And now I have to decide, am I going to ski the little avalanche slopes with a few trees on them, or the big avalanche slope with no trees on them, or the really big avalanche slope with the convex roll and this additional terrain with overhead hazard that could also get me into trouble, or do I stay away from all of it? If I'm not sure, I stay away from all of it. If I can start, defining these a little better, isolating them, figuring them out, following the evaluator, it might be that I'm like, okay, I feel pretty good about going into these trees. It does avalanche here, but it doesn't do it very often. I have escape terrain and my exposure time is very small. Haven't seen any recent avalanche activity. You run through the list. And if anything in there jumps up, it's like, ooh, we got to back off. But if you're comfortable with it and everyone in your group is comfortable with it, then you know what? At least you're making informed decisions, which greatly improves your odds. It's never 100%, but it's a more informed decision. Cool. All right. Oh, yeah. Don't mind me. So let's do some field observations, shall we? So field observations are basically exactly what the evaluator is teaching us. And let me show you what they are. I'm going to run this video twice because there is some audio in there I'd like you to hear. I can't have both channels open at once. So we'll do this twice and I'll talk it. Okay, let's do it again. This time I'll give you the narration. So, if you're seeing avalanches running, hazard's high. If you're seeing more than 1 or 2 slides. And if you're seeing a lot of evidence of very recent avalanche activity, you know there's a weak layer. You know that if it can be triggered naturally, it can be triggered with a human weight. So either of those basically are excellent indicator you've got a problem. You've got a weak layer and it's just waiting for you. Bad. Step back. Once it's had some time to settle, that's a different story. Precipitation. The rule of thumb is if you're seeing 3 centimeters an hour or more for more than 3 or 4 hours, it's bad. Or if you're seeing 25 centimeters over a 25-hour period, then you know what? The world has changed enough that you need to completely reassess. Wind is another factor. Okay, so these are beautiful contrails coming off. The snow is being redistributed. Some areas are being scoured, others are being loaded. Watch this now. Whoomph! And the camera operator actually shakes. So that's a really good warning sign. Radiating cracks, same thing. See how that just took off? You know, half a meter in front of my skis. Not those little cracks around your skis, but big shooting radiating cracks. I had one, I was guiding the Yoho Traverse a few years ago, 2 years ago. And as I worked my way up Yoho Peak, I was really trying to keep my group on the ridge. And I got to a spot where I had to make a little turn. So I had to step out onto the face, just one ski length out on the face. And as I was making the turn, I got this big shooting radiating crack on a 40-degree slope. And it moved about 4 centimeters and then it stopped. And I took out to grab my ski pole, put it in the crack, and I measured the depth. That's where my weak layer is, and it's still touchy. Radiating cracks, really good information. And then if you're at the back, you know, and the day goes from icebox to basically hot oven, that's a lot of energy going in the snowpack. If you're at the front breaking trail, then you can't tell temperature, because in minus 30, I'm down to a t-shirt, you know, punching through thigh-deep snow trying to break a trail for my group. Use a thermometer whenever you're in doubt. But these are really good warning signs. If I'm seeing recent avalanche activity, I get whoomph or radiating cracks, you know what? I'm thinking that I've got a significant problem and I really don't want to expose myself to avalanches. Particularly, I don't want to get into the start zone. Stay out of the steep terrain, stay out of the open slopes that are steeper, and make sure there's nothing big and steep over your head. If I'm seeing significant amounts of wind, that's a concern and I got to watch it. But it's not necessarily an immediate deal breaker. However, be careful, because the wind tends to sneak up on you. It's like nothing, 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 and then all of a sudden you notice you're in the middle of an avalanche cycle and it didn't snow. But there was an awful lot of transport through wind. So you definitely don't want to turn your back on that. Precipitation, you know, ski hills like to tell you that half a centimeter is a good storm cycle. No. But as soon as you start seeing 3 centimeters an hour or more sustained for more than 3 or 4 hours, that's a lot of load in a short period of time, and the snow might start to react. If you're seeing 25 centimeters over a day, that's a lot of load over a short period of time, and the snowpack is going to start to react. That's not a universal rule. On the coast, tends to take, generally speaking, not always, it tends to take a bit more precipitation and a bit more time, or more snow over less time seems to be what you need for it to go. And in the Rockies, things can get pretty wild with less snow and less time. With less snow. Yeah, with less snow. Because we often have weak layers fairly prominent in our snowpack to begin with. So it's a balancing act with precipitation rates. On the coast, you got more latitude. In the Rockies, we'd love to see big storms, but they often produce significant avalanche cycles. Rising temperatures, you know, on their own should always be watched, but unless you know what else is going on, it may not be a deal breaker. If you're not sure what's going on, then definitely this is a red flag. Okay, so those are really good tools, and you can combine them because it's part of your evaluator. Memorize that list. So let's go on a trip, shall we? So, congratulations, you won an all-expense-paid trip to a backcountry lodge. You were so excited you forgot to check the bulletin. Have you learned nothing? But the next morning, you get there, you notice there's 20 centimeters of fresh snow on the ground. It's the first clear day that they've been able to fly, and this is what you see in the front as you fly to the hut. Based on your field observations, what'd you see? Okay, so as we go through there, right there, 2 avalanches that occurred probably during the storm. Oh, so there was avalanche activity. Because if there's 20 centimeters down in the valley, there's probably more up high. What else is going on? Ah, look at those tails behind the rocks. That's caused by wind. The wind was blowing and in that direction. So we've been looking at the windward slope, which means this other side probably has more snow and more activity. Recent avalanche activity during the storm and wind. Huh. So, this being the first day after the storm, are you going to just jump out and go skiing all the big lines? Yeah. You're going to pull back. And you're going to take time to gather more information, but just from sitting and looking out the window, you've actually got pretty good information. And you don't need a helicopter. I can't tell you how many times I've nearly driven off the road because I've got my head out the window driving to wherever I'm going to work and looking at the mountains, looking at the amount of new snow on the road, looking at the wind and how it's been affecting the landscape, which way is it blowing from, how much is being moved, looking for recent avalanche activity, how big are the cornices, gathering all this information so that I can make a better decision. Or I can use that information and say, okay, I like the bulletin, it's pretty much on the mark, or hey, things are a little different here than what the bulletin advised. Because bulletins are for very large regions, and weather can sometimes be very micro in scale as to how it's impacted your snowpack. So you have to constantly question and challenge your available information. So let's do that again. I love this stuff. Let's go for a flight. Oops, wrong spot. I want you to look and just see if you can pick up some recent information that might be useful for figuring out what's going on in the mountains. This is flying into Purcell Mountain Lodge. Okay, so what'd you see? So we were going in there. What I saw was pretty defined cornices, which means there's been a substantial amount of wind over the winter. We're on the lee slide. And look, some of the cornices have started to break off and they've produced pretty large size 2 avalanches. Okay. So now I've got some information. And then I take that and I compare that with the bulletin, and do they match? Does the bulletin have these same warnings? And then you work with it, whichever one gives you the more conservative answer. Okay, so this is all cool, and I'll try and wrap this up in, what time is it? In 10 minutes. I'll get close. All right, so this is a really fascinating research experiment that Cam Campbell did. He was working for Bruce Jameson. I think he was working on his master's thesis, and Cam gave me permission to reproduce some of his work. What he did is he did a snow test called a Rooch block, which is used to identify potential weak layers in the snowpack. And I'm just going to skip ahead here, and I'll show you the Rooch block, and then you'll understand what the results mean. There we go. Okay, so a Rooch block must be done on a slope. That's about 30 to 35 degrees. It's 2 meters across, 1.5 meters deep. It takes 2 people to cut the back of the block. So it's a free column. If it fails while you cut it, that's a 1. If it fails while you step on it, that's a 2. If it fails with a knee jerk, that's a 3. If it fails with a jump, that's a 4. If it doesn't fail, you jump again. And if it fails, it's a 5. If nothing happens, you step down to the middle of the block, and you can jump on it 3 more times. And if you get a clean layer that fails, that's a 6. But if you'll notice, all I did was kick out the fluff, the fresh snow, still part of the wall there. So that is not considered a failure, and that's a 7. So here's a block of snow that I know has a weak layer. It didn't fail when we cut it, so that's a 1. Doesn't fail while I step on it, so that's a 2. Doesn't fail with a knee jerk, but look at that, planar failure, roost block 4, and there's another weak layer. I jumped on it, it collapsed, that's a roost block 5. Okay, don't worry about that. And this is just bad technique. All right, so that's the roost block. Now, it was considered a fairly accurate test because we're looking for weak layers in the snowpack and we're using a live weight. And originally, the roost block had to be done by an individual weighing 80 kilograms with no pack. The Swiss came up with that. We've since sort of lightened things up and said, no, you don't. Just use someone of average weight and use the same person every time so you have consistency. But it also has problems because you're actually jumping on the slope. And if it's a big slope and you trigger an avalanche, well, you're in the worst place possible. So it has limitations in terms of where you can do it. However, it can be a useful test for identifying weak layers. And this is what Cam used to look for weak layers in this snowpack here just below this little windroll. And this is terrifying because you'd expect the whole thing to basically say we've got a weak layer, but it doesn't break easily, so it'd all be 4s and 5s. It's not. Or it's a really sensitive snowpack and it's touchy, which this one is, so we're all going to get 1s and 2s and maybe 3s. We don't. This is spatial variability. And this is part of what's going to fry your brain when you're in the backcountry. Because right here, they scored 7. The block did not fail. However, the one right below it, just as Cam was stepping on it, the block failed. Okay, 7, go ski it. 2, stay away. My God, what do you do? Right over here, 3, just took a knee jerk and it failed. Above it, 1 jump and it failed. Another one, jump and it failed. Over here, no failure. This one down here, 2 jumps. Right below it, stepped on it, it failed. So this is what we call spatial variability. It's essentially chaos within the snowpack. And I feel very comfortable calling it chaos because weather defines your snowpack. And weather defines chaos theory. Chaos theory was developed by basically a programmer who worked in weather forecasting. And I apologize, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head right now. But he basically created what's called the butterfly effect. And he demonstrated mathematically how a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon rainforest could produce a tornado in Texas 2 years later. Now, don't get hung up on this. Butterflies aren't trying to kill us. And all he was doing was demonstrating the level of uncertainty and chaos within any environment. And snow laid down through, the wind and the variation in temperatures produces weak layers that may not react perfectly normal. But part of chaos theory also says that there are patterns within chaos, and that is the key. That's how we can forecast the weather and say there's an 80% chance of rain tomorrow. And what that means is 4 out of 5 times that we say this, 80% of the time, it's going to rain. And they're pretty accurate, actually. We love to give, weathermen the gears or meteorologists the gears, but when you backtrack their forecasts, when they say 60%, it's usually about 6 out of every 10 times. They're right, which is exactly what they're saying, because they can only be so accurate. This is no different. If you look at the data, 87% of these test scores indicate that this snowpack is dangerous. It's not stable. We're scoring 2 to 5. Okay? 13% of the tests gave a false positive that said the snowpack is probably pretty stable. Okay. That's what's important, is you look for the patterns. If the avalanche bulletin says 3, you get whoops and radiating cracks. and then you wander over to this slope and you do a roosh block and you score a 7? Wait a second. No, 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 no. That's not the way you play this game. You don't even have to dig the roosh block. You've got whoops and radiating cracks. That tells you have a weak layer and is human triggerable. And the Avalanche Bulletin says the hazard is 3, considerable. Perfect scenario for whoops and radiating cracks. Okay, I'm buying that. And I don't trust that one roosh block test. Do 3 or 4 more in different locations and see what your results are. If all of those tests come back as 6 and 7, then you can say, wait a second, something's going on here that's different about this slope. But if you're just going off one test that says things are good, when lots of information are saying things are bad, that is a problem. And that's when you're going to get into trouble. So spatial variability is huge. Look at the big picture. The only time you look at specific pieces of data is if it's incredibly high quality information. And high quality information is when the slope you're thinking of skiing just rips out and avalanches before you get there. That's a skier remote or a sled remote. But it's basically, it was so touchy that just you approaching that feature triggered it. Okay. Things are really touchy. Forget the bulletin. Look at that and just say, okay, the avalanche hazard is considerable or high. Simple. Stay out of avalanche terrain. If everything says things are good and your tests support that things are good, that's useful. But if things look good and you get a few tests that suggest things might be bad, you're scoring 3s and 4s in your roosh block, and you got a few of them, you know what? I'm going to start to believe these test results over the general pattern because I got 2 or 3 of them, and they're much more site-specific than the general information. So you can see how these tests are tricky. You're looking for patterns, you're looking for consistency. Because, you know, take that variability and look at this group. Someone's going to hit a sweet spot if there's a problem. And because we didn't space out one at a time, we're all going to pay for it. So that was a scenario where I had very high confidence that the snowpack was stable. Okay. And that leads us to instability tests. But you know what? We've been going at this for 3 hours, and I'm not going to go at it anymore, just out of respect for you. We'll pick it up tomorrow at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. If you have any questions, please don't be shy. You can ask me. I'll start things up a little early tomorrow, ask some questions, and yeah, it's what I'm here for, and it lets me know that you're actually listening to me and not just letting this run while you watch YouTube. Because frankly, I'm just sitting in a room all by myself, hoping to get back and see some Christmas goodies are left over while I kick back and watch TV. So thank you guys. Thanks for showing up. Tomorrow, same time, same place, and like I said, I'll start up a little bit earlier so that there'll be time to answer some questions. We went through quite a lot. If I can leave you with some homework, look up the Avalanche Bulletin. Go to avalanche.ca, check out the map, see how it works, and look up the Avalanche Bulletin for, how about Glacier National Park? Looks like they just had a good storm cycle in there, so we might see something interesting. Sound good? Glacier Park, just west of the Purcells. And thanks for the evening, guys. Thanks for showing up. Okay, so you're very welcome. I'm just going to let this run for a couple of minutes to see if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to go see if my son left me any Christmas goodies. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to shut her down.